The most deafening sound in football is not the roar of 100,000 voices. It is not the explosive grunt of a 300-pound lineman meeting a blocker, nor the sickening, hollow pop of a perfect tackle. It is the silence that follows. It is the complete, vacuum-sealed stillness that descends upon a stadium when a man does not get up, when the trainers sprint, not jog, when the cart comes out. It is a collective, breath-held pause where the spectacle of sport falls away and the raw, human vulnerability at its core is laid bare. That silence is a threshold. For the player on the ground, it is the threshold between a career and a life. For the game itself, it is a moment of inconvenient truth, swiftly covered by the blanket of applause as the player is driven away, a brave warrior departing the field. We tell ourselves that story. But what of the players who cross that threshold and never truly return? Not from the injury itself, but from the idea of who they were supposed to be. This story begins with such a silence. But the injury was not to a knee or a shoulder. It was to a legacy. It was a deliberate, systemic silencing. There is a man, a quarterback, who played his last down over 3 decades ago. You will not find his jersey retired. His name is not invoked alongside the great innovators. He will not be a finalist for the Hall of Fame. His case debated on cable television. In the official history of the National Football League, he is a footnote, a curiosity, a stat line that reads good, not great. He is remembered, if at all, for how he did not win, rather than for how he thought. And yet, if you watch football today, any game, any team, you are watching his vision. You are watching his intellectual property executed by millionaire athletes and lauded as the genius of coaches who were in grade school when he was dissecting defenses. The offensive concepts that define the modern era, the sight-adjust routes, the packaged plays, the elimination of the huddle as a standard, the transformation of the quarterback from a game manager to a pre-snap architect. These were not born in the mind of some visionary coordinator in the 2000s. They were scribbled in the margins of a playbook by a man whose own coaches thought he was overcomplicating things. He saw the field as a geometric equation, a dynamic puzzle where every moving part presented a solution. The league saw him as a problem. They called him soft. They called him a system quarterback. They whispered that he was more of a coach on the field, and they did not mean it as a compliment. In a world that worshipped arm strength, brute force, and the mythological clutch gene, his weapon was his processing speed. His genius was anticipatory. He did not throw receivers open. He threw them to where they would become open, a distinction so subtle it was heresy. He believed football could be intellectualized, that its violence could be subverted by calculus. This made the football traditionalists deeply uncomfortable. A game built on conquest reduced to a spreadsheet, it was an affront to the very mythology they sold. So, when his teams fell short, when a receiver dropped a perfect pass in the end zone, when a defender made a superhuman play, when the sheer, chaotic brutality of the sport overcame his elegant designs, the establishment nodded sagely. See? He thinks too much. Football is a heart game, not a head game. And so, they began the work of writing him out of the story. His final season was not his last on the roster. His final season was the protracted, decades-long campaign to sanitize his contribution. It was the season of erasure. It began with his trade, a quiet dismissal to a fading franchise. It continued through years of backup roles, where he was labeled a mentor, a teacher, a great football mind. These are the patronizing titles given to players whose physical gifts are deemed insufficient, a way to cage their intellect and use it for the benefit of others. He would sit in meetings and offensive coordinators, men with half his understanding, would lecture on defensive tendencies and he would bite his tongue. He would watch young, strong-armed phenoms struggle with basic coverage reads, and he would offer a suggestion, phrased as a question. Have we considered the weak side linebackers drop? The suggestion would be ignored until 3 weeks later, the coordinator would present the same solution as his own epiphany. His ideas were absorbed through a process of osmotic plagiarism. They seeped into the league's bloodstream, stripped of their origin. By the time he retired, the process was complete. The league had moved on. The West Coast offense was the new revolution, credited to a small circle of coaching giants. The run and shoot had its evangelists, His ideas, which predated and influenced both, were fragmented, dispersed, and repackaged. Coaches who had once rolled their eyes at his detailed film reports now installed his core concepts, forgetting where they first saw them. The language of the game changed, adopting his terminology but not his name. He became a ghost in the machine, a spectral presence in every no-huddle drive, every pre-snap pointer, every quick slant called against a blitz. He is the reason a quarterback today can approach the line with 5 plays in his head, ready to choose based on a single defensive alignment. He demonstrated that the defense, for all its disguised intentions, always reveals its hand a moment before the snap. He taught a generation that the game is won before the ball is ever moved. I first encountered his ghost in a conversation with a retired scout, a man with 50 years of evaluating talent. We were talking about the evolution of the quarterback position, and I mentioned the usual pantheon: Montana, Marino, Elway, then the modern wave of Manning, Brady, Rodgers. The old scout shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "You're all talking about the singers," he said, his voice gravelly. "Nobody remembers the guy who wrote the song. The song all of them are singing." He wouldn't give me the name, not then. He just said, "Find the quarterback who made everyone else look like they were playing yesterday." That sent me down a rabbit hole of archived game film and dusty statistical abstracts. I wasn't looking for highlight reel throws. I was looking for pre-snap movement, for subtle shifts in the offensive line, for the way a quarterback's head would snap to a certain defender an instant before the ball was hiked. And in the grainy, color-saturated footage of the late 1970s and early 1980s, I found him. His team's uniforms were outdated, the film quality poor, but his process was crystal clear and utterly alien to his time. While other quarterbacks took the snap and then began their progression, he was often throwing before his back foot was set, because the progression had ended before the ball was in his hands. He played the game in fast forward. To understand why he was forgotten is to understand the NFL's deep-seated need for archetypes. The league narratives are simple, clean, and marketable. The gunslinger, the magician, the field general, the warrior. He fit none of these. He was the theorist. And the theorist is not a hero's journey America knows how to sell. His career arc lacked the canonical tragedy of a career cut short by injury or the redemptive glory of a late career championship. His arc was one of quiet, persistent correctness, met with consistent institutional resistance. He did not lose his arm, he lost the narrative. And in the end, losing the narrative is a fate worse than any physical injury. It is a death of legacy. It is the silence that follows the final snap, stretching on for decades. This is the mystery we are here to solve. Not a whodunit, but a why was it forgotten. It is an excavation of a mind buried under the rubble of football history. We will meet the teammates who witnessed the birth of a new football logic and are still haunted by its dismissal. We will confront the coaches and executives who, out of jealousy, ignorance, or sheer institutional inertia, failed to see what was in front of them. We will follow the clandestine journey of his ideas, passed like samizdat literature from one backup quarterback to another, from one low-level assistant to another, until they finally found fertile ground. And we will sit with the man himself, now in the autumn of his life, to ask the simple, devastating question: what does it feel like to watch the world you designed, knowing you have been scrubbed from the blueprint? This is not a story of nostalgia. It is a story of theft. It is the story of the forgotten quarterback and the final season of silence that has lasted a lifetime. To understand the crime, you must first understand the scene. The era into which our quarterback arrived was not merely a different time in football. It was a different cosmos. The National Football League of the 1970s was a league of empires built on simplicity and of emperors who ruled by fear and force. It was a black and blue world, both in the literal bruises on players' bodies and in the stark, uncomplicated philosophy that governed the sport. Offense was not about finesse. It was about imposition. You ran the ball until the defense broke, and then you ran it some more. The forward pass was a necessary evil, a risky venture to be deployed on 3rd and long or when you were behind. The quarterback was a manager, a distributor, a tough guy who handed off and occasionally threw deep to a receiver told simply to go get it. The playbook was a scripture, handed down from coach to player, and deviation was blasphemy. The mindset was encapsulated by the legendary coach who famously said, "Football isn't a contact sport. It's a collision sport. Dancing is a contact sport. Intellect was suspect. Innovation was a threat." This was the football ecosystem, a closed, self-reinforcing loop of tradition. Coaches were former players who taught what they had been taught. Scouts looked for the same physical prototypes. The system was designed to replicate itself, to produce a consistent, brutal, and marketable product. Then, a series of subtle tremors began. Rule changes in 1978, designed to protect quarterbacks and free up receivers, unintentionally laid the groundwork for an intellectual revolution. The game was being tilted, ever so slightly, away from pure brutality and towards strategy. But the old guard didn't see it as an invitation to innovate. They saw it as an annoyance. The door was cracking open, but no one inside the fortress was looking at it. They were too busy polishing their armor. Into this world came a generation of quarterbacks who would become legends for their physical prowess. Terry Bradshaw's cannon arm, Ken Stabler's swaggering cool. Yet, simmering in the background was a different kind of mind. It did not emerge from the traditional pipelines, not from a football factory university or a gritty blue-collar town where the game was a religion of physicality. It emerged from somewhere else, a place that valued precision, analysis, and systems. Our quarterback was a product of a different logic. He approached the game not as a warrior, but as a cryptographer. His weapon was not his arm, but his ability to decode. And his great insight, the one that would eventually reshape the sport, was this: football is not a game of perfect execution. It is a game of leveraged mistakes. Every defensive scheme, no matter how complex, contains within it a flaw, a vulnerability exposed by the very alignment it presents. The key was to identify that flaw before the snap, and to have a play designed not for a specific yardage, but to exploit that specific momentary weakness. This was the core of the conflict, the fault line that would define his career and his erasure. It was innovation versus tradition, but more specifically, it was intellect versus physicality. The establishment believed the game was won by the stronger, faster, tougher men executing a proven plan. He believed the game could be won by the sharper mind adapting a fluid plan to the specific, unfolding reality of the defense. It was a clash of worldviews. One was romantic, rooted in the mythology of combat. The other was almost chillingly rational, rooted in the principles of game theory and systems analysis. The old guard spoke the language of passion, of heart, of desire. He spoke the language of leverage, of conflict, of solution. They were speaking past each other, and in that dissonance, a revolutionary was born and subsequently buried. The evidence of his influence is not found in trophies, though his teams won. It is not found in Pro Bowl selections, though he earned them. The evidence is found in the words of the men who played with him and against him, and in the startled recognition of modern tacticians who have retroactively discovered his work. A Hall of Fame defensive back from that era told me, playing against him was a nightmare, but not for the usual reasons. He didn't scare you with his arm. He embarrassed you with his brain. You'd think you had the perfect coverage disguised, and he'd check to a play that made your entire scheme look foolish. It was humiliating. A former linebacker said, "We had a name for him in our meetings. We called him the calculator. We'd game plan all week, and on the first series, he'd punch in a few numbers and our whole plan would just spit out an error message." These are testimonials to his effect, but they are also clues to his marginalization. Being called the calculator in the 1970s NFL was not a compliment. It was an accusation of inhumanity, a lack of the essential gritty football soul. The most compelling evidence, however, lies in the lineage of his ideas. When I interviewed a renowned offensive coordinator of the modern era, a man credited with developing a prolific passing attack, I asked him about his philosophical roots. He spoke of mentors, of books, of classic film study. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned a series of grainy tapes he inherited from a retiring coach in the early 1990s. They were just unlabeled reels, he said. But when I watched them, it was like seeing the Rosetta Stone. This quarterback, whoever he was calling plays that we thought we invented 20 years later. He had answers for blitzes we hadn't even conceived of yet. I built my entire system on the principles I saw in those tapes. I never found out who the quarterback was. The tapes were just marked Conceptual Series, 1979. That coordinator's offense would go on to revolutionize the league. He won awards. He was hailed as an offensive genius. And the ghost in his machine, the unnamed architect, remained in the shadows. This documentary is a journey to pull that architect into the light. It is a 4-part excavation of a stolen legacy. Our path is clear. First, we will travel back to the beginning to trace the origins of this unique mind. We will explore the environment that formed him, the experiences that sharpened his analytical approach, and his entrance into a league utterly unprepared for his mode of thought. This is the story of the Prodigy and the first sparks of dissonance. Next, we will chronicle the revolution itself. We will break down film play by play to show you not just what he did, but how he thought. We will demonstrate the specific innovations, the sight adjustments, the route progressions based on defender depth, the packaged plays that were born in his film sessions and executed on the field, often to the bewilderment of his own coaches. This is the story of a vision made manifest and the immediate backlash it provoked. Then we will document the exile. This is the painful core of our story. We will follow the institutional resistance as it solidifies from skepticism into active opposition. We will examine the trade, the benching, the labeling, and the slow, professional suffocation that followed. We will hear from the decision-makers who, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes defiantly, explain why they chose to sideline a genius. This is the story of how the NFL, unable to deny his results, chose instead to dismantle his narrative. Finally, we will pursue the legacy. We will track the diaspora of his ideas, following them as they seep into the league's consciousness through back channels and loyal disciples. We will show his concepts appearing without attribution in the playbooks of champions. We will sit with him today, in the quiet of a life after football, and confront the profound irony of his existence, to be the author of a story in which he is not a character. This is more than a sports story. It is a case study in how institutions handle disruptive genius. It is about the price of being ahead of your time. It is about the uncomfortable truth that progress is often achieved not by the system embracing the innovator, but by the system co-opting the innovation and discarding the innovator. The NFL, in its relentless forward march, has a habit of chewing up and spitting out the very people who propel it forward. We remember the winners who fit the myth. We forget the thinkers who built the template for winning. Our quarterback built that template. He drew the map that every team now follows. And for that, he was rewarded with oblivion. Our journey is an attempt at correction. It is an effort to restore a missing chapter to the history of the game, and in doing so, to ask an uncomfortable question of ourselves as fans. Why were we so willing to forget? What does our collective amnesia say about what we truly value in our heroes? The answers may not be found in the roar of the crowd, but in the silence we have left in his wake. Let us begin. The story does not begin on a football field. It begins in the quiet, vast emptiness of the Great Plains, under a sky so large it makes every human endeavor feel both insignificant and intensely private. This is not the cradle of football folklore. There are no steel mills here, no crowded inner-city lots, no Friday night dynasties that define entire towns. Here, the rhythm of life is set by the harvest, by the weather, by the slow, patient calculus of agriculture. It is a landscape that teaches a specific kind of intelligence, strategic patience, an understanding of complex systems, and a profound respect for variables beyond one's control. You do not conquer the prairie. You analyze it. You adapt to it. You survive it through foresight. This is the soil in which our quarterback's mind took root. He was not a football prodigy in the conventional sense. There was no legend of him throwing spirals through tire swings at age 5. Instead, the first inklings of his genius were quieter, more analytical, almost furtive. His father, a man of few words and meticulous habits, was a high school mathematics teacher and part-time farmer. Their bond was not built on playing catch, but on problem solving. The young boy would sit at the kitchen table, not with sports pages, but with his father's old coaching manuals from a brief stint as an assistant, manuals that were less about motivation and more about geometry. They would draw plays, but his father would stress the why behind the what. "This isn't a football play," his father would say, his finger tracing the path of a pulling guard. "This is a physics problem. You have a force moving in this direction. How do you create a greater force in the opposite direction? The ball is just the object being transferred. The game is happening in the spaces between the players." This was his foundational language. While other future stars were learning to read defenses, he was learning to read systems. He devoured books on military strategy, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, not for their violence but for their emphasis on deception, leverage, and the economy of force. He was fascinated by chess, but quickly grew bored with its static nature. The pieces did not move with the flawed, unpredictable humanity of athletes. His true classroom was the land itself. Working on the farm, he developed a preternatural sense of anticipating patterns. The way a storm cloud would gather, the path a stray calf would bolt, the precise point where a fence line was weakest under pressure. Football, when he finally played it in the organized, underfunded program of his small-town high school, was simply another system to decode. He was not the best athlete on the field. He was, however, the only player who saw the field as a schematic. His high school coach, a gruff traditionalist who believed in 3 yards and a cloud of dust, was initially baffled by him. The boy would come to the sidelines and not just report what he saw, but offer interpretations. "Coach, their safety is cheating up every time we go I formation. If we show I and then shift to an empty backfield, he'll be out of position for the post route." The coach would stare, uncomprehending. The suggestion was not in the playbook. The playbook, a scant dozen pages, was gospel. Innovation was insolence. The boy's intellect was treated first as a curiosity, then as an annoyance, and finally as a threat to the coach's authority. Here was the first great suppression, the first indication of the lifelong conflict to come. His strategic mind was not nurtured. It was disciplined. He was told, in no uncertain terms, to stop thinking and start executing. So he learned his first painful lesson, to hide his intelligence. He would execute the simple play called, but within its rigid framework, he would make his own adjustments. A handoff was called, but he'd see the linebacker shooting the gap, so he'd subtly alter the running back's path with a touch on the hip. A sprint out was called, but he'd see the cornerback sitting on the out route, so he'd throw the ball behind his receiver, knowing the receiver would break his route off. These were silent, invisible corrections. They worked. The team won. But the credit went to the system, to the toughness of the boys, never to the quarterback's clandestine calculus. The recruitment process, or lack thereof, further illustrates the blindness of the football establishment to his particular gift. College scouts came through looking for prototypes. They measured height, weight, arm strength, 40-yard dash times. They put him through drills designed to test physical reflexes, not cognitive processing. He performed adequately, not exceptionally. His throwing motion was efficient, not picturesque. He was polite, quiet, not brimming with the charismatic bravado recruiters associated with leadership. The major football factories passed. He was an afterthought, a possible walk-on. He eventually accepted a scholarship to a small, academically rigorous liberal arts college, a school known more for its engineering program than its football team. It was here, in an environment that finally valued intellect, that his football mind was given its first tentative permission to breathe. The coach, a young, progressive-minded former quarterback himself, recognized something in the freshman's eyes during film study. It wasn't passion. It was a quiet, intense focus, like a watchmaker examining a complex movement. The coach began to ask him questions. "What are you seeing here?" The floodgates opened. The quarterback would speak for 10 minutes straight, deconstructing a defensive end stance, the depth of a linebacker's drop, the heel alignment of a safety, weaving it all into a predictive model of the defense's intentions. The coach was stunned. He had never heard a player, let alone an 18-year-old, speak about the game with such surgical precision. He made a fateful decision. He would build his offense not around his own philosophy, but around this young quarterback's capacity to process information. It was a radical, risky delegation of authority. For the next 4 years, in the obscurity of small college football, a revolution was quietly prototyped. The coach and the quarterback became collaborators. They designed an offense that was less a list of plays and more a menu of responses. It was based on concepts rather than plays. A concept like spacing taught receivers to find open grass versus zone coverage, not to run a rigid route. A concept like mesh was designed to create traffic and leverage against man coverage. The quarterback was given unprecedented control at the line of scrimmage. He would call 2 plays in the huddle, a personnel package and a concept. Then, at the line, based on his pre-snap diagnosis, he would choose the concept and communicate it through a series of audibles and hand signals that looked like random fidgeting to the defense. The results were statistically absurd. He completed over 68% of his passes in an era when 55% was considered elite. He threw for touchdowns at a record rate, yet his passing yards were not gaudy. He took what the defense gave methodically, ruthlessly, moving the chains with the efficiency of a surgeon. They won conference championships, but national attention was minimal. The NFL scouts who occasionally drifted through were dismissive. The system was a gimmick. The competition was weak. The quarterback was a product of the system. A label that would haunt him, a label that fundamentally misunderstood the truth. He was the system. He had co-authored it. The few scouts who looked deeper were puzzled. One later recalled, his tape was confusing. He wasn't making throws that wowed you. He was making throws that seemed to happen before the defense even moved. It was like he had a script. I remember thinking, this kid is either a savant or he's stealing signals. We didn't have a category for him. And so, he entered the NFL draft not as a heralded future star, but as a cerebral project, a late-round flyer, an anomaly. He was drafted by a team with an entrenched veteran quarterback and a conservative, run-first defensive coordinator. He was brought in not to innovate, but to learn, to conform, to sit. He arrived in the professional ranks carrying a fully formed, revolutionary football intellect, a mind that had already designed and executed a sophisticated offensive prototype. And he was entering a league whose gates were guarded by men who believed football was played with the heart, not the head, and who saw his quiet, analytical demeanor not as depth, but as a deficit of the necessary fire. The prodigy from the Prairie had solved the game at his level. Now, he would face the far more complex puzzle of institutional resistance. The laboratory days were over. The war for the soul of the game was about to begin. The professional football world does not greet innovation with open arms. It greets it with a standardized physical, a playbook the thickness of a phone directory, and a weary skepticism born from having seen 1,000 hotshot kids come and go. When our quarterback arrived at his first NFL training camp, he was not seen as a revolutionary. He was seen as a late-round draft pick, a line on a depth chart, a warm arm to run the scout team. The team that drafted him was a model of staid, physical, traditional football. They had a legendary, grizzled head coach, a man we'll call Vince Lombardi Jr., though that is not his name. Coach Lombardi was the embodiment of the establishment. He had played linebacker in the league, had coached for 30 years, and believed in a simple, brutalist football philosophy. Establish the run, play tough defense, protect the football, and win the war of attrition. His offense was a derivative of the system his own mentor had run in the 1960s. It was a language of concrete, not of calculus. The playbook was a series of specific, immutable calls. I right, 26 power. Pro left, 936 Y shallow cross. Each play had one purpose, one primary receiver, one red. The quarterback's job was to execute the called play with precision and toughness. Audibles were rare, and when allowed, they were simple, binary choices, green for a run, red for a pass. Thinking was to be done during the week in the meeting rooms. On Sunday, you were to be a well-programmed automaton of muscle memory and will. Our quarterback received this tome of established wisdom with polite respect. He stayed up through the night, not just memorizing it, but reverse engineering it. He looked for the underlying principles, the connective tissue between plays. He began making notes in the margins, drawing arrows, writing small, cryptic annotations. If Mike backer widens, check to fade. He scribbled next to a play designed to attack the middle. Versus, cover 2 shell. This becomes a high-low on the safety. He was instinctively trying to transform a static list of plays into a dynamic, responsive system. This did not go unnoticed. During the first week of classroom installation, the offensive coordinator, a gruff former offensive lineman and loyal Lombardi disciple, was diagramming a play on the board. He finished, chalked dust on his fingers, and asked if there were questions. The room of veterans, rookies, and backups was silent, either comprehending or, more likely, unwilling to speak up. Then, from the back of the room, a quiet voice. Our quarterback. Coach, on that Y-stick concept, if the nickelback jumps the stick route, is the Y option to sit in the window or to break his route to the corner? And if he breaks to the corner, does that change the quarterback's footwork from a 3-step to a hitch and go? The coordinator stared, his face blank. The question was not about the play as drawn. It was about the play as it might live and breathe against a specific, unpredictable reaction. It was a question that acknowledged the defense had a vote. The coordinator blinked. Son, he said, his voice a low rumble. The Y runs the stick. The quarterback throws the stick. That's the play. Don't outsmart your cleats. A few veterans chuckled. The quarterback nodded, silent. It was the first small public defeat. His curiosity was framed as complication. His desire for comprehensive understanding was labeled as overthinking. The real clash, however, occurred not in the classroom, but on the practice field, and it was with Coach Lombardi himself. During a 7-on-7 drill, the quarterback, running the second-team offense, faced a defensive look he recognized from film. The called play was a curl-flat combination to the right side. As he took the snap, he saw the outside linebacker sink into the flat zone, taking away the primary read. Instinctively, a habit forged in college, he looked to the backside. His tight end, running a shallow cross, was being trailed by a linebacker. But the quarterback saw the leverage. The linebacker was on the tight end's inside hip. In a split second, he altered the throw, leading the tight end to the outside shoulder, away from the defender. It was a completion, a gain of 12 yards. A good play by any measure. The whistle blew. Coach Lombardi, who observed every drill with a hawk's intensity, stormed onto the field. He didn't go to the quarterback. He went to the tight end. You ran the wrong route. Lombardi barked. The tight end, confused, stammered, Coach, I ran the cross. You broke outside. The route is a cross. You stay on your track. Then Lombardi turned to the quarterback. His face was a mask of controlled fury. You threw him off his route. You do not ever change the route. The route is the route. You throw the ball to the spot the route is designed to hit. Period. You are not the offensive coordinator. You are the quarterback. Your job is to execute the system. My system. The message was not about one play. It was a foundational decree. The system was holy. Individual interpretation was heresy. The quarterback's greatest skill, his adaptive, responsive decision-making, was being formally outlawed. This was the cage he found himself in. He could physically make every throw. He knew the playbook better than the coaches. But his football intellect, the very core of his being as a player, was deemed superfluous, even dangerous. He was told to see less, not more, to anticipate nothing, and simply react to what the play design dictated. It was intellectual suffocation. Yet, within this prison, he began to innovate in the only way left to him, within the confines of the called play. He started to study not just his own playbook, but the minutiae of his teammates' techniques. He learned that his split end, a savvy veteran, had a tell when he was planning to round off his out route versus cutting it sharply. He learned that his split end, a savvy veteran, had a tell when he was planning to round off his out route versus cutting it sharply. He learned that his running back, when pass protecting, would always lean slightly in the direction of the blitzer he was most worried about. He began to use this information not to change the play, but to enhance its execution within the rigid framework. If he saw his receiver's tell, he would throw the ball a fraction earlier to a slightly different spot. It wasn't an audible. It was a microscopic adjustment, invisible to the coaches but transformative for the play's success. He also turned his analytical focus inward on his own process. He developed a pre-snap routine that was a masterpiece of information gathering. His head would swivel not with panic but with a systematic scan. Safety depth, linebacker width, cornerback technique. He was forbidden from changing the play, but he was gathering data that allowed him to process the post-snap picture with lightning speed. While other quarterbacks were still on their first read, he was often arriving at his second or third, because he had already predicted the coverage's reaction. These were silent, internal innovations. They produced results. In preseason games, operating the simplistic offense, he completed passes at a startlingly high rate. He rarely turned the ball over. He moved the chains. The sports writers covering camp began to note his poise and efficiency. Coach Lombardi saw the same tape and saw a quarterback who was managing the game. A faint praise term meaning he wasn't screwing up the system. The veteran starter, a beloved, strong-armed traditionalist, remained the unquestioned leader. But a quiet, perplexing truth was beginning to form in the minds of a few astute observers. This kid, running a basic offense designed for a game manager, was performing with a level of precision and anticipatory calm that the system itself did not require or even encourage. He was, through sheer force of cognitive will, making a simple system look complexly effective. The skeptic in the head coach's office saw a compliant pupil finally learning the right way. The reality on the film was something far more subversive. A revolutionary, learning to speak the language of his captors fluently enough to secretly plot his escape. The first battle was lost. The playbook was law. But the war for how that playbook would be executed was just beginning. And the quarterback was discovering that even within a prison, you could map the guard rotations, learn the lock mechanisms, and wait for your moment. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected, born not from opportunity, but from injury. The opportunity arrived not with a fanfare, but with a sickening crunch. The veteran starter, dropping back to pass in the second game of the season, took a blindside hit from a blitzing safety. The sound of the impact echoed through the stadium. He lay on the turf, clutching his knee, his season over. The crowd fell into that familiar, deafening silence. And from the sidelines, our quarterback took off his baseball cap, his heart pounding not with anxiety, but with a terrifying clarity. This was it. The system that had been his cage was now his responsibility. Coach Lombardi, his face grim, put a hand on his shoulder pad. "Just run the offense," he growled. "Don't try to be a hero. Hand the ball off, throw the safe passes. Manage the game." It was the same instruction he'd been given for months. But as he jogged onto the field, the 11 defensive players staring him down, he knew he could not simply manage. To survive, he would have to control. And to control, he would have to unleash carefully the system he had been building in his mind all along. This would be the first blueprint, not drawn on a chalkboard for approval, but etched onto the field through live action, one audacious, unapproved audible at a time. He lost his first game. He played cautiously, within the confines of Lombardi's system, and they were defeated by a superior team. The following week, however, something shifted. Trailing by 10 points in the third quarter, facing a third and long, he came to the line and saw a defensive alignment he had studied relentlessly. The play called was 22Z shallow, a basic run. It was a terrible call against the defensive front he saw. In the huddle, he made a decision. He changed the play. He didn't use the approved red audible. He used a series of words and numbers that sounded like gibberish. Rocket. Omaha 42. Rocket. It was a vestige of his college system, a full concept change he had drilled with his receivers in unsupervised summer workouts. Rocket. It was a vestige of his college system, a full concept change he had drilled with his receivers in unsupervised summer workouts. The team looked at him, startled, but broke the huddle. At the line, he saw the defense hadn't adjusted. He took the snap, executed a quick 5-step drop, and hit his slot receiver on a smash concept against cover 2 for a 25-yard gain. The drive ended in a touchdown. They lost the game, but in that series, A silent pact was forged between the quarterback and the offensive players. He had shown them he saw something they didn't, and he had the courage to act on it. More importantly, it worked. Coach Lombardi, from the sideline, had seen the check. He was furious, but he had also seen the result. In the film room on Monday, he confronted the quarterback. "What was that?" he demanded. The quarterback, for the first time, did not lower his eyes. He walked to the chalkboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and for 20 minutes, he deconstructed the defensive front, the covered shell, the leverage of the nickelback, and explained why the called run was doomed and why the smash concept was the mathematically correct solution. He spoke not in the language of passion, but of geometry and probability. The room was silent. The offensive coordinator scoffed, but a few veterans nodded. The logic was irrefutable. Lombardi stared, his arms crossed. He saw not insolence, but a cold, terrifying competence. He had a choice. Bench the quarterback and lose, or grant him a sliver of leash and possibly win. Grudgingly, he gave a single, curt nod. "You get 2 a game," he said. 2 audibles. "And if they don't work, you're back on the bench." It was a crack in the wall. It was all the quarterback needed. What followed was the clandestine implementation of a football revolution. His 2 audibles became a Trojan horse. He didn't use them to change single plays. He used them to install entire concepts at the line. The first radical change was the implementation of the option route. In Lombardi's system, receivers ran predetermined routes. Under the quarterback's silent directive, certain receivers, starting with the sharp, veteran tight end, were given freedom. On a pass play, the receiver would read the defender's leverage. If the defender played outside, he'd break in. If he played inside, he'd break out. The quarterback would read the same leverage and throw accordingly. It was football's equivalent of jazz improvisation based on a chord chart. It made the receiver and quarterback co-pilots, reading the same instrument panel. Defensive backs, trained to recognize route patterns, were suddenly chasing ghosts. The quarterback's pre-snap reads became a sophisticated diagnostic ritual. He would align the offense, then begin a series of sharp, coded calls. Kansas City. Kansas City. This might tell the offensive line the protection scheme was sliding left. Reno. Reno. This might tell the running back he was responsible for the weak side linebacker if he blitzed. Then, a hard count to see if the defense would flinch, revealing blitz or coverage intentions. In the 2 seconds between the end of his cadence and the snap, he was conducting a symphony of information, making final, silent calculations. The ball would be snapped, and he would often throw it immediately, not because the play was a designed quick pass, but because his diagnosis was complete. He was playing the game in a condensed time frame the defense wasn't operating in. The second innovation was the packaged play. This was his masterstroke. A packaged play is a single call that contains both a run and a pass option, where the quarterback makes the decision after the snap based on one defender's reaction. In the 1970s, this was heretical. Running plays and passing plays were separate entities. The quarterback designed a simple package, a weak side zone run paired with a quick slant by the outside receiver. His read was the conflict defender, usually a linebacker or safety. If that defender crashed down to stop the run, the quarterback would pull the ball and throw the slant into the vacated area. If the defender dropped into coverage, he would hand the ball off. He installed this not through the coaches, but in player-led walkthroughs. The first time he ran it in a game, it gained 23 yards. The coaches in the booth were confused. The film showed a run call, but the quarterback had thrown a pass. Had the receiver run the wrong route? Had the quarterback made a mistake? Only when they watched it repeatedly did they realize the terrifying elegance of it. The quarterback had created a play that was inherently unstoppable because it was a reaction to the defense's choice. It was a logical paradox made flesh on a football field. Defenses, built to stop either a run or a pass, had no answer for a play that was both simultaneously. The team's identity began to morph. They were still Lombardi's tough, defensive-minded team on the surface. But offensively, they were becoming something else. Efficient, unpredictable, and ruthlessly logical. They didn't have long, time-consuming drives. They had short, surgical possessions. The quarterback's completion percentage soared. He rarely took sacks because his internal clock and pre-snap reads allowed him to get rid of the ball or check to a hot route. They started to win. Not in blowouts, but in tight, controlled games where they possessed the ball just enough, scored just enough, and let their defense rest. Teammates' testimonies from that season are uniformly awestruck. The center told me, "I'd come to the line expecting to run block, and I'd hear him make a call, and I'd know, okay, we're throwing it. And I never knew how he knew, but he was always right. It got to the point where we just stopped thinking. We just listened." The primary receiver said, "He'd throw the ball to a spot, and you'd better be there, because he wasn't throwing it to you. He was throwing it to the solution. If you were in the way of the solution, you caught it." They were becoming extensions of his central nervous system, executing a game plan that was being written in real time inside his helmet. By mid-season, the team was over .500, a surprise to the league. The press dubbed them opportunistic and scrappy. They credited Lombardi's tough coaching and the defense. The quarterback received polite mentions for his game management. But those who really watched saw the truth. In a league dominated by physical imposition, this team was winning through intellectual imposition. They were imposing a framework of choice on the defense where every option was wrong. The blueprint was no longer a secret. It was on film for every opponent to see. And yet, they couldn't stop it, because stopping it required a defensive coordinator with a mind as fluid and adaptive as the quarterback's. Such a mind did not exist in the NFL of that era. The quarterback had not just found a way to win. He had exposed a fundamental flaw in the sport's strategic paradigm. He had proven that the human mind, properly trained and empowered, could process information faster than 11 supremely gifted athletes could physically react. The first blueprint was complete. It was elegant, effective, and entirely unauthorized. And as the wins piled up, the man who had granted that initial grudging leash began to feel not pride, but a deep, unsettling fear. He was losing control of his own team to a logic he did not fully understand. The success, it turned out, was more threatening than any failure could ever be. The following season dawned not with hope, but with expectation. The crack in the wall had become a doorway, and through it walked a fully formed football philosophy. The two audibles restriction was a forgotten joke, a relic of a more primitive time. Coach Lombardi, a pragmatist above all else, had been forced to surrender. His team's unexpected success, its offensive efficiency, the glowing, if somewhat confused media coverage, all of it pointed to an uncomfortable truth. The kid's way worked. So, in the off-season, Lombardi made a momentous, humbling decision. He summoned the quarterback to his office. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old leather. "All right," Lombardi said, not looking at him, but out the window at the empty practice field. "You've got the keys. The offense is yours to design with the coordinator. But listen to me. If this goes off the rails, if we start losing because you're getting cute, it ends. And it ends for good." It was not a blessing. It was a conditional surrender. For the quarterback, it was everything. For the first time in his professional life, the system could be an extension of his mind, not a constraint upon it. What followed was the season of revelation. This was the year the ghost in the machine stepped into the light, and the football world witnessed, for a brief, dazzling moment, what the future of the sport looked like. The offense installed that summer was a thing of terrifying beauty to those who understood it, and perplexing simplicity to those who didn't. It had a name, finally, the concept-based progression system. It discarded the old play-calling lexicon entirely. There were no more 936 Y-shallow cross calls. Instead, the play call in the huddle was a concept and a formation: zebra spacing, eagle mesh, rocket Y-cross. Each concept was a rulebook for every receiver on the field, a set of guidelines based on coverage. The quarterback's job was to diagnose the coverage pre-snap, confirm it post-snap, and progress through his reads according to the concept's built-in answers. It was football as a branching narrative, where the quarterback was the author choosing the plotline in real time. Defensive coordinators, used to stealing signs and recognizing formation tendencies, were suddenly blind. The formation didn't tell them the play. It only told them the starting point of 1,000 possible plays. The statistical output of that season, when viewed through a modern lens, is not merely impressive. It is an anomaly that borders on impossibility for its era. In a league where the average completion percentage hovered around 53%, he completed 67.8% of his passes. In a league dominated by bruising running backs, his offense averaged 4.8 yards per carry not because of a superstar runner, but because his packaged plays and pre-snap reads created advantageous numbers in the box. He threw 28 touchdown passes against only 5 interceptions. His passer rating, a statistic barely acknowledged at the time, would have shattered the existing record. But the most telling statistic was one nobody kept: time to throw. Analysis of game film shows his average release time was 2.1 seconds from snap to pass. The league average was closer to 3.0. That 0.9-second difference is a geological epoch in football time. It meant his offensive line, merely adequate, appeared dominant. It meant pass rushers, no matter how ferocious, consistently arrived a hair's breadth too late, their efforts ending in a frustrated swipe at air as the ball was gone. He wasn't avoiding pressure. He was erasing it through prescience. The tangible proof was in the film week after week. There was the game against the reigning conference champions, a team with a legendary, complex blitz package. On a critical third and long in the fourth quarter, the defense showed a chaotic, shifting front with 6 men on the line. The quarterback stepped to the line, surveyed the chaos, and didn't flinch. He made a single, sharp call: rip, rip. The offensive line slid their protection. He took the snap, took one quick drop, and fired a laser to his slot receiver on a hot slant for a first down. After the game, the champion team's defensive coordinator, a proud veteran, was asked what happened on the play. He looked exhausted, defeated. "He had the answer before we had the question," the coordinator said, a quote that would later become infamous. "We showed him a look we'd saved for 6 weeks. He checked to the perfect play in 2 seconds. You can't defend that. You can only hope he makes a mistake." He didn't make mistakes. He turned defensive complexity into offensive simplicity. A 6-man blitz was no longer a threat. It was a clue, telling him where the football should go. Then there was the Monday night game under the lights, a national audience watching. The opponent was a divisional rival known for its punishing, man-to-man coverage, a "we know what you're running and dare you to beat us" philosophy. The quarterback's response was a surgical masterpiece. He employed a concept called levels on passing downs, flooding zones with receivers at different depths, forcing man defenders to navigate a labyrinth of crossing routes. But his true weapon was the option route, now given to multiple receivers. The broadcast cameras would isolate on his primary target, a tight end, and you could see the defender desperately trying to mirror his movement. The tight end would stem his route, hesitate, then break outward as the defender leaned in. The ball would arrive, perfectly placed, the moment the receiver turned his head. It was a pitch-and-catch drill against the best athletes in the world. By the third quarter, the rival coach was seen on the sidelines screaming at his defensive backs, throwing his headset in frustration. His scheme, his team's entire defensive identity, was being publicly deconstructed live on national television. The final score was lopsided. The post-game narrative focused on the rivals' off night. Few acknowledged that the quarterback had orchestrated that off night. The team finished the regular season with the best record in the conference. They were headed to the playoffs not as a scrappy underdog, but as a legitimate contender. The offense was no longer efficient. It was explosive. The quarterback was named to the Pro Bowl. He was the subject of magazine profiles that struggled to define him. They called him the professor and the brain, labels that still carried a faint whiff of otherness, of novelty. But the respect within the league was real and growing. Younger quarterbacks sought him out after games to ask questions. Offensive coaches from other teams requested permission to visit during the offseason, a request Lombardi routinely denied. The system was operating at its peak, a perfect synthesis of mind and execution. The players believed without question. The center, in an interview from that time, said it best: "It felt like we were cheating, not illegally but cosmically. We had the answer key. Everyone else was still taking the test. The pinnacle, the moment of purest revelation, came in the divisional playoff game. It was a frigid day, the field hard and unforgiving, conditions made for Lombardi's old school, run-heavy football. And for a half, they tried to play that game. They trailed by 10 points. In the locker room, there was tension. Lombardi wanted to double down on the run, to out-tough the opponent. The quarterback stood up. He was not a fiery speaker. His voice was calm. They're crowding the box. Every run is a 2-yard gain at best. Their corners are playing soft, afraid of the deep ball. The middle of the field is open. The answer is in the middle of the field. He wasn't arguing, he was stating a fact. Lombardi looked at him, then at the defensive coordinator, who gave a reluctant nod. The coach swallowed his pride. "Fine," he grunted. "Do it." The second half was a display of such precise, cerebral football that it has become the stuff of quiet legend among film aficionados. Abandoning the run almost entirely, the quarterback operated from the shotgun, a radical formation at the time, and dissected the defense with a series of quick throws over the middle. Slants, digs, shallow crosses. He used the freezing weather to his advantage. His receivers knew exactly where to be, while the defensive backs, hips stiffened by the cold, struggled to change direction. He led 3 consecutive touchdown drives, each one a methodical, clock-chewing march of completions. He didn't throw a single pass longer than 20 yards in the air. He didn't need to. He was proving that football could be won with the short, accurate pass as a replacement for the run, a concept that would not become league orthodoxy for another 20 years. They won going away. In the freezing cold, on a stage built for barbarians, the theorist had proven his theory under the highest pressure imaginable. The season of revelation was complete. The blueprint was not just drawn. It was validated in the playoffs. He had reached the mountain summit, and it was from that height that he would soon be pushed. For in the world of the NFL, nothing is more dangerous than a prophet whose predictions have all come true. Success in the NFL is a combustible element. It can forge unbreakable bonds, or it can act as a catalyst, exposing every hairline fracture in an organization's foundation. The season of revelation did not unify the team in triumph. Instead, it acted as a centrifuge, separating the players and coaches who embraced the new logic from those who felt alienated, threatened, or rendered obsolete by it. The whispers began not in the losing locker rooms of opponents, but within the very walls of their own facility. They started as murmurs in the training room, subtle eye rolls in meetings, offhand comments to trusted reporters. They were the sound of an establishment realizing it had created, or rather, had been forced to tolerate, a monster it could no longer control. The quarterback's cerebral approach, the source of their success, was also the source of a deep, gathering resentment. The epicenter of this discontent was, perhaps inevitably, the offensive coordinator. Here was a man who had spent 20 years climbing the ladder, mastering the old language of football, waiting for his chance to call plays and shape an offense in his image. Now, in his moment of ascension, he found himself a bystander, a translator for a system he did not author and barely understood. The quarterback designed the weekly game plan with him, but with was a generous term. It was more a presentation. The quarterback would arrive with detailed breakdowns, suggesting concepts and adjustments for specific opponents. The coordinator's role was to legitimize it, to put his name on it, to call the concepts during the game, but the architecture was undeniably the quarterback's. In staff meetings, the coordinator's contributions grew sparse. When Coach Lombardi asked for his input, he would often defer, saying, "Well, the quarterback feels strongly about attacking this coverage with the mesh concept here." It was a subtle, professional emasculation. The coordinator began to seek allies. It was a subtle, professional emasculation. The coordinator began to seek allies. He would corner the running backs coach, a fellow old-school tactician, and complain. "He's turning the game into a damn spreadsheet," he'd mutter. "Where's the feel? Where's the instinct? He's a robot." This sentiment found a willing audience. Position coaches who prided themselves on teaching technique, how to deliver a crushing block, how to run a precise route tree, were uneasy with the quarterback system, which often asked players to make reads and decisions on the fly. It made their jobs harder. It introduced variables. It implied that technique alone was insufficient, that football IQ was paramount. This was a direct challenge to their expertise and their value. The resentment seeped into the locker room, but in more complex ways. The defense, initially grateful for the rest provided by the efficient offense, began to feel a quiet jealousy. Their hard-hitting, gritty work was becoming the backdrop to the quarterback's cerebral ballet. The media coverage, while still praising the team effort, increasingly focused on the offensive innovation. Defensive players, the heart and soul of Lombardi's original team identity, felt they were becoming supporting actors in someone else's show. A star linebacker from that team told me years later, we'd be in meetings and they'd show the offensive tape and it was all about the concept and the red. We'd watch our tape and it was about hitting gaps and being physical. Felt like two different sports. And honestly, our way felt more like football. The real football. What he was doing felt clever, but was it tough? Could you win in January playing like that? This question, asterisk, was it tough? Asterisk became the central, corrosive whisper. It was a question that bypassed results and went straight to the mythology of the sport. It framed his success as something fragile, intellectual, and therefore less worthy. Among the offensive players, the divide was generational and intellectual. The younger players, the receivers and tight ends who thrived on option routes, were devout acolytes. They loved the responsibility and the freedom. A veteran offensive lineman, however, gave me a more conflicted view. Look, it worked. We moved the ball. But there's a brotherhood in lining up and telling the guy across from you, we're running it here. Stop us. It's a test of wills. With him, it was like we were tricking them. It didn't feel the same. There was less satisfaction. We weren't imposing our will. We were outsmarting their will. It's a different thing. This notion that outsmarting was somehow less virtuous than overpowering was a powerful undercurrent. It painted the quarterback's genius as a form of deceit, a lack of authenticity. It was within the quarterback's own quarterback's room, however, that the most personal betrayals took root. The backup quarterback, a journeyman with a strong arm and a traditional mindset, was the coordinator's confidant. The coordinator, seeking to reassert his authority, would spend extra time with the backup, critiquing the starter's approach. He's making it too complicated, the coordinator would say. The game is simple. See it, throw it. All this pre-snap nonsense. If you just make the throws, you don't need it. The backup, eager for a chance to play, internalized this. He started to believe the system was a crutch, that any competent quarterback could succeed with these trick plays. He began to voice this to other players, a passive-aggressive campaign that framed the starter's intelligence as a lack of fundamental, throwerly talent. I could make that throw, he'd say after a completion on an option route. The implication was clear. The starter was a product of the scheme, not a transcendent talent. This narrative was poison, and it began to seep into the external world. The narrative war began in earnest in the press. Sports writers, many of them former players or close to the coaching staff, started to hear these whispers. The stories that emerged were nuanced but damning. They praised the wins but questioned the method. A column after a key victory read, "The offense continues to baffle opponents with its array of option routes and quick throws. One has to wonder, however, if this style is sustainable in the crucible of the playoffs." Football, at its core, remains a game of physical and mental toughness. Can a team that relies so heavily on finesse and pre-snap deception summon the raw, gut-check grit required to win a championship? The language was carefully chosen. Finesse, deception, sustainable. It positioned the innovation as a temporary trick, a fluke soon to be exposed. Another writer, citing unnamed team sources, wrote, "Some in the building worry the offense has become too reliant on the quarterback's pre-snap diagnoses, leaving little room for the instinctive, playmaking ability that often defines great players in big moments." These unnamed sources were the coordinator, the backup, the disgruntled position coaches. They were launching a proxy war in the media, shaping the perception of the quarterback from a revolutionary into a fragile, system-bound operator. The quarterback was aware of the whispers. How could he not be? He was a master of reading subtle cues. He saw the coordinator's tightened smile. He heard the backups just loud enough comments. He read the papers. But his response was not to confront or to campaign. It was to retreat further into his methodology. He believed, with the unwavering faith of a scientist, that the results would silence the critics. The film was his truth. The win-loss record was his argument. He failed to understand that the conflict was no longer about football logic. It was about power, credit, and the soul of the sport itself. He was fighting a tactical battle in a strategic war. His very detachment, his focus on the film rather than the politics, was used against him. It was framed as aloofness, a lack of leadership, proof that he was more computer than commander. A watershed moment came during a close game. After a failed third-down conversion where the quarterback made the correct read but the pass was dropped, he came to the sideline and immediately went to the tablet to review the film of the defensive look. Coach Lombardi, wanting to fire up his team, was in the middle of an emotional speech. He saw his quarterback staring at a screen. After the game, Lombardi snapped at a reporter who asked about the offensive rhythm. "Sometimes you need to feel the game, not just think it," he barked, a soundbite that ricocheted through the media ecosystem. It was the head coach, the man who had surrendered the offense, publicly voicing the core resentment. The dam was breaking. The season of revelation had revealed not just a new way to play football, but a deep and abiding fear of that new way. The quarterback was no longer just an opponent for other teams. He was a threat to the internal order of his own organization. The whispers were now a drumbeat, and they were marching him toward a cliff, where one misstep, one moment of very human failure, would provide all the justification his detractors needed to declare the experiment a noble, but ultimately flawed idea. The foundation for his exile was being laid, brick by bitter brick, by the very people who benefited from his genius. The injury did not occur on a spectacular, high-risk play. It was not a blindside blitz from a legendary pass rusher, nor a heroic, leaping dive for a first down. It was, in the cruel poetry of football, a testament to his own style's success. Late in the third quarter of a game they were leading comfortably, he took a quick three-step drop and fired a pass to his hot read on a slant. The pass was complete, the ball released in under 2 seconds. As he followed through, his right foot planted firmly in the turf, a defensive lineman, beaten by the quick throw, stumbled forward off his block. His full weight crashed onto the back of the quarterback's planted leg, a freakish, collapsing pile of force on a joint that was never designed to bear such a load from that angle. There was no dramatic crack, just a sickening, deep pop felt more than heard. He went down not with a cry, but with a sharp, exhaled grunt. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of horror for a fallen warrior. It was the confused silence of a machine that had broken in a way no one anticipated. He had avoided the big hit for so long, only to be felled by a random, almost mundane accident of physics. He knew instantly. As the trainers rushed out, he lay on his back, staring at the gray sky, and his first thought, with crystalline clarity, was not about pain, but about diagnosis. Asterisk posterior cruciate ligament, medial collateral, possibly the meniscus, minimum 8 months. The season is over. Asterisk. The medical diagnosis was severe but straightforward. A complex knee ligament tear, requiring reconstructive surgery, ending his season. The institutional diagnosis, however, began immediately and followed a far more sinister pathology. In the press conference the next day, Coach Lombardi stood at the podium, his face a mask of stoic concern. "It's a tough break," he said, his voice gravelly. "Football is a violent game. Injuries happen. We'll rally around the backup and keep moving forward." The language was standard, but the subtext was being woven in real time. Violent game. The implication was clear. This was the inevitable price of doing business, a proof of the sport's inherent brutality that even his quick-release intellect could not circumvent. But then Lombardi added, almost as an afterthought, a line that would become a key piece of evidence in the narrative war. "He's a tough kid. He takes hits. This was just a freak thing. He takes hits." It was a faint defense that subtly reinforced the idea he was often hit. It planted a seed. Perhaps his style, for all its avoidance of sacks, put him in vulnerable positions. Perhaps his reliance on quick throws in the pocket left him as a stationary target for chaos. Within the building, the framing was less subtle. The offensive coordinator, now suddenly thrust back into full command of the offense he never truly owned, spoke to the offensive unit. "This is a setback," he said. "But football doesn't stop. We're going back to basics. Solid, fundamental football. No more dancing around. We're going to line up and be physical." The message was a barely veiled critique of the injured quarterback's entire approach. Dancing around was the pejorative for pre-snap movement and option routes. Basics and physical were the coded language of the old religion. The backup quarterback, now the starter, echoed this in his first media appearance. "I'm just going to play my game," he said, puffing out his chest. "See the field, make the throws. I'm not going to overthink it. Sometimes you just have to let it rip." The contrast was meticulously constructed. The injured thinker versus the healthy, instinctive player. The complex system versus simple, tough football. The media, primed by months of whispers, pounced on this inflection point. A prominent columnist wrote a piece titled, "The Limits of Cerebral Football." The argument was elegantly vicious. It praised the quarterback's intelligence and regular season success, but posited that his injury exposed a fatal flaw. Can a style built on avoidance ultimately survive the unavoidable violence of the NFL? The column asked. His system was designed to minimize big hits, but it could not account for the random, brutal entropy of the trenches. In seeking to outsmart the violence, he may have simply proven that violence always has the final say. True toughness, the kind that wins championships, isn't just mental. It's the ability to withstand the physical punishment he has now inevitably succumbed to. This was the master narrative crystallized. His intelligence was a response to a lack of traditional physical toughness. The injury was not bad luck. It was proof of a fundamental unsustainability. Even the language around his rehabilitation was weaponized. Reports from inside sources described him as engaged in his rehab, but focused on his use of film and diagrams to understand the biomechanics of his recovery. This was presented not as dedication, but as further evidence of his remove from the gritty reality of the game. "He's treating his knee like a math problem?" One unnamed scout was quoted as saying in a magazine profile of the team's struggling offense. The backup was struggling mightily. The offense had regressed to the bottom of the league, and yet the narrative was not, "The team misses its quarterback." It was, "The system fails without its specific operator," implying the system was a fragile, high-maintenance contraption, not robust football. The quarterback experienced this marginalization from a distance, first from a hospital bed, then from the solitude of the rehab facility. He watched the games on television, saw his offense bastardized, heard the commentary. The most isolating moment came when he was finally cleared to attend team meetings, walking with a significant limp and a brace. He entered the offensive meeting room, a place that had been his domain. The coordinator was at the board, installing a simplistic, run-heavy game plan. He nodded at the quarterback. "Good to have you back. A name? Just listen in." He was a guest. He was not consulted. During film review, a play from the previous game was shown where the backup held the ball too long and took a sack. The quarterback instinctually spoke up. The mic backer showed blitz and then dropped. The hot read was the flare to the running back. It was there. The room went quiet. The coordinator turned from the screen. "He's learning," the coordinator said flatly, referring to the backup. "We're keeping it simple for him. Different philosophies." The dismissal was absolute. His insight was no longer the solution. It was a relic of a different philosophy, a failed experiment. He was being phased out intellectually before he was even cleared to play physically. The inflection point was now complete. The injury had provided the necessary pretext. It allowed the institution to perform a catastrophic logical reversal. Before the injury, his intelligence created efficiency, which protected him, which led to wins. After the injury, his style, while clever, could not protect him from the NFL's inherent violence. proving it was ultimately fragile, and his intelligence was perhaps a compensation for a lack of the primordial toughness required to be a lasting champion. The cause of his success was retroactively rewritten as the cause of his downfall. The seed of system quarterback now bloomed into the full, poisonous flower of injury-prone system quarterback. His body's betrayal became the final, irrefutable argument for his critics. As he worked alone in the training room, rebuilding the very ligament that had given way, the organization was busy dismantling the legacy of the mind that ligament had carried. The scaffolding for his exile was no longer being built in whispers. It was being erected in broad daylight, with the injury as its cornerstone. He was no longer the future. He was a cautionary tale. And the next step, the logical conclusion of this new narrative, would be to see if the cautionary tale could still be of any use, or if he was now merely a damaged piece of history to be stored away. The medical clearance was official. After 10 months of brutal, solitary rehabilitation, the doctors signed the form. The ligament was stable. The muscle had been rebuilt. The quarterback was, by every physiological metric, ready to play. He returned to the practice field with the quiet fervor of a scholar returning to his library. The offense had floundered in his absence, scoring points at a league-worst rate. The backup had been exposed. The coordinator's simplistic play calling had been ridiculed, and the team had missed the playoffs. Logic dictated a restoration. The franchise quarterback, the architect of their only recent success, was healthy. The team needed him. The calculus was simple. But institutions, especially wounded ones, do not operate on logic alone. They operate on pride, on power, on self-preservation. The decision to bench him was not made in a single moment, but in a series of small, calculated moves that formed a chokehold. The public reason, the one delivered to the press and sold to the fans, was a masterpiece of concerned pragmatism. Coach Lombardi stood at the podium in the preseason, his jaw set. "The backup has made tremendous strides," he declared. "He's earned the right to start. Our quarterback is coming off a significant injury. We want to be smart. We need to see where he is, football-wise. He'll compete, and we'll see how it plays out." The language was protective, almost paternal. Asterisk, we want to be smart. We need to see. Asterisk, it framed the decision as one of caution, of long-term stewardship of both the player and the team's interests. The underlying message, however, was corrosive. He was damaged goods. His football readiness, the very essence of his being, was now an open question. The injury was no longer a past event. It was a permanent modifier attached to his name. The backup had earned the job through his struggles, a narrative that valorized gritty persistence over proven genius. Behind closed doors, the truth was uglier and more strategic. The coordinator, having tasted full control again, even in failure, could not countenance a return to being a glorified secretary. He presented Lombardi with a damning, self-serving analysis. He compiled cut-ups of every sack the quarterback had taken before the injury, every time he had been hit, framing them not as the cost of doing business but as evidence of a fatal flaw in his style. "Look," he would say, pointing at the film. "He holds the ball here, waiting for the option route to develop. He's a sitting duck. His system requires perfect timing. If one guy is off, he gets killed. Is that what we want for our investment?" More insidiously, he presented the offensive struggles of the previous year not as proof of the quarterback's value, but as proof of the system's incompatibility with anyone else. "It's not an NFL system," the coordinator argued. "It's a cult. Only he can run it. What happens if he gets hurt again? We're back to square one. We need an offense that any competent quarterback can run." This argument preyed on Lombardi's deepest fears: volatility and dependency. The quarterback's brilliance was recast as a liability, a high-wire act without a net. The final, unspoken truth was about credit and legacy. Lombardi, a man who had built his reputation on toughness, saw his team's identity becoming synonymous with the quarterback's cerebral approach. The season of revelation had not been his revelation. It had been an abdication. Restoring the quarterback meant surrendering permanently, admitting that the future belonged to a logic he would never fully understand. The backup, for all his limitations, was his guy. He ran the plays called without question. He embodied the old virtues: If they won with the backup, it would be a victory for Lombardi's football, for toughness, for the established order. If they lost with the quarterback, it would confirm the doubts. Behind closed doors, the truth was uglier and more strategic. The coordinator, having tasted full control again, even in failure, could not countenance a return to being a glorified secretary. He presented Lombardi with a damning, self-serving analysis. He compiled cut-ups of every sack the quarterback had taken before the injury, every time he had been hit, framing them not as the cost of doing business but as evidence of a fatal flaw in his style. "Look," he would say, pointing at the film. "He holds the ball here, waiting for the option route to develop. He's a sitting duck. His system requires perfect timing. If one guy is off, he gets killed. Is that what we want for our investment?" More insidiously, he presented the offensive struggles of the previous year not as proof of the quarterback's value, but as proof of the system's incompatibility with anyone else. "It's not an NFL system," the coordinator argued. "It's a cult. Only he can run it. What happens if he gets hurt again? We're back to square one. We need an offense that any competent quarterback can run." This argument preyed on Lombardi's deepest fears: volatility and dependency. The quarterback's brilliance was recast as a liability, a high-wire act without a net. The final, unspoken truth was about credit and legacy. Lombardi, a man who had built his reputation on toughness, saw his team's identity becoming synonymous with the quarterback's cerebral approach. The season of revelation had not been his revelation. It had been an abdication. Restoring the quarterback meant surrendering permanently, admitting that the future belonged to a logic he would never fully understand. The backup, for all his limitations, was his guy. He ran the plays called without question. He embodied the old virtues. If they won with the backup, it would be a victory for Lombardi's football, for toughness, for the established order. If they lost with the quarterback, it would confirm the doubts. If they lost with the quarterback, it would confirm the doubts. The choice was not about winning games in September. It was about controlling the narrative of the franchise's soul. The quarterback experienced the benching not as a single announcement, but as a slow-motion suffocation. It was in the practice reps. He would take the second-team snaps, executing plays that were pale, dumbed-down imitations of his own offense, throwing to receivers who were no longer given option routes. The timing was gone. The chemistry, built on years of nuanced communication, was systematically dismantled. He would see a coverage and instinctively begin to change the play at the line, only to hear the coordinator's whistle shriek across the field. Run the play called, "Name, second team, let's go." The humiliation was public, in front of the very players who had once followed him without question. The starter, the backup, now carried himself with a swagger that was both pathetic and devastating. He would pat the quarterback on the helmet after a good throw in practice. "Looking good, Professor. You'll get there." The condescension was a weapon. The profound personal betrayal crystallized in a private meeting in Lombardi's office. A week before the season opener, the quarterback, seeking clarity, asked for a definitive answer. Lombardi leaned back in his chair, avoiding his eyes. "It's not about you," he said, a phrase that is never true. "It's about the team. We've installed a system that everyone is comfortable with. The backup has the command right now. Your time will come. You need to be a team player." The quarterback listened, and in that moment, he saw the entire architecture of the deception. The system everyone is comfortable with was a euphemism for the coordinator's regressive playbook. Command meant blind obedience. Team player meant silent acquiescence to his own professional demise. He was being asked to endorse his own obsolescence. The coordinator froze the film. "Now, this is interesting," he said, his tone pedagogical. "Our quarterback here, he makes this throw. It's a good throw. But look, he used the laser pointer. He's throwing to a spot. He's expecting the receiver to be there based on his pre-snap read. It's a gamble. If the safety doesn't bite on the look-off, it's a pick six." The backup saw the safety didn't bite, so he held the ball. That's growth. It was a staggering Orwellian reinterpretation of events. The quarterback's anticipatory genius was recast as a dangerous gamble. The backup's failure to see an open receiver was praised as prudent caution. His own film, The Proof of His Mastery, was being used as a teaching tool against him, his success rewritten as luck, his process as fallacy. In that dark room, he understood the finality of it. They were not just benching his body. They were erasing his mind. They were rewriting history itself, and they were making him watch. The benching was complete. He was now a prisoner of war in his own facility, forced to witness the dismantling of his own legacy, play by play, frame by frame. The release was not dramatic. It was a transaction, a line of small print in the newspaper's sports section. After a second season languishing as a clipboard holder, watching the team he built stumble through mediocre seasons with his system stripped back to its most primitive form, the organization declined to renew his contract. There was no farewell press conference, no tribute video. He cleaned out his locker into a single cardboard box. Playbooks filled with his marginalia, a few trinkets, the worn-out cleats from the season of revelation. The goodbye from Coach Lombardi was a handshake and a platitude. You've got a great football mind. Someone will give you a shot. It was a dismissal disguised as a compliment. He was now a free agent, a veteran with a damaged knee and a reputation as a cerebral backup, a great football mind who could not hold on to a starting job. Thus began the wandering years, the period of the Nomad. He was not pursued as a savior, but collected as a curious artifact, a high-priced insurance policy, a mentor for a young prospect. With each new city, a new jersey, a new playbook, and the same cycle of hope, exploitation, and disillusionment. His first stop was with an aging contender, a team with a legendary but declining Hall of Fame quarterback. He was signed explicitly as a mentor and a security blanket. The head coach, an offensive guru with a media-friendly reputation, welcomed him warmly. "We're so excited to have your experience in the room," the coach gushed. "We want to pick your brain," and pick they did. In meetings, the young offensive coordinator would lean on him heavily. How would you attack this coverage with these personnel? The quarterback, eager to contribute, would diagram concepts, suggest route adjustments, explain coverage keys. The coordinator would nod enthusiastically, scribbling notes. By mid-season, elements of those very concepts began appearing in the game plan. The quarterback would see them during the week installation, a familiar shape disguised with new terminology. He'd point it out. "That looks like the zebra spacing concept we discussed." The coordinator would wave a hand. "Oh yeah, a little variation we've been tinkering with. Great minds think alike." It was the first stark lesson in professional osmosis. His intellectual property was being absorbed, repackaged, and sold as the organization's own innovation. He was a living textbook, and they were photocopying pages without citing the source. When the aging starter went down with an injury, the team turned not to him, but to a younger, stronger-armed backup. The coach explained, "We need a spark. We need to take shots downfield." His knowledge was valuable, but his physical self, the vessel of that knowledge, was deemed inadequate. He held the clipboard for the younger man, teaching him the nuances of the very system he helped create for them. His second stop was born of desperation. A perpetually struggling franchise with a raw, first-round draft pick at quarterback signed him to a 2-year deal. The mandate was clear. Teach him how to be a pro. Teach him how to study. Here, the dynamic was different. The young quarterback was humble, eager, a sponge. For a brief, beautiful period, the Nomad found purpose. He spent hours with the rookie not just on the playbook, but on the philosophy of playbook mastery. He taught him how to watch film not as a spectator, but as a detective. How to tie a defensive end stance to a coverage shell. How to use a hard count as a diagnostic tool. He saw flashes of his younger self in the rookie's rapid comprehension. The rookie began to flourish, showing startling pre-snap awareness for a first-year player. The media praised the young quarterback's natural feel, and the head coach's brilliant offensive design. The Nomad was mentioned, in passing, as a valuable veteran presence. Then the head coach was fired. A new regime arrived with a new system and a new veteran quarterback they personally favored. The Nomad was released before the final year of his contract. At his exit meeting, the young quarterback, now the entrenched starter, thanked him sincerely. "You changed how I see the game," he said. It was a genuine, private moment of gratitude, but it was also a eulogy. The pupil had absorbed the lessons and would carry them forward. His career a testament to the teacher's influence. The teacher, however, was once again packing his box. His greatest success here was making himself obsolete. His final stop as a player was with a cynical win-now organization. They had a volatile, supremely talented starter and no viable backup. They signed the Nomad days before the season opener. The football operation was chaos, a dictatorship run by a mercurial head coach. Here, there was no pretense of mentorship. He was a warm body, an emergency button. The offense was a disjointed collection of the head coach's favorite plays, with no underlying system. In a quarterback meeting, the Nomad, seeing an obvious flaw in the protection scheme for a critical play, ventured a suggestion. "Coach, if they bring the nickel off the edge here, the back is responsible for the Mike backer. We might be hot off the edge." The head coach, a man of towering ego, stared at him with contempt. "Son, I've been calling plays for 20 years. I know protections. You know what your job is? Know the play if we need you. That's it." The message was absolute. Your mind is not welcome here. Only your arm, in the direst of circumstances, might be tolerated. He was a fire extinguisher behind glass, only to be used in an emergency and never to be consulted on fire prevention. He spent the season in profound isolation, utterly disconnected from the weekly game plan, a stranger in the quarterback room. It was during this season that the profound disillusionment set in, not as a sharp pain, but as a cold, settling weight. He realized the league had found the perfect equilibrium for dealing with him. They would consume his ideas but marginalize his person. They would quote his philosophy but never cite the author. He was a ghostwriter for the league's evolving offensive narrative. His name left off the cover of every new edition. The media narrative during these nomadic years solidified his caricature. He was the ultimate backup, a coach on the field, a walking playbook. These were all epithets that praised his mind while definitively placing him outside the circle of true players, of doers. Articles would mention his influence on young quarterbacks, always framing it as a consolation prize for a man who couldn't cut it as a starter. His injury was always mentioned in the first paragraph of any profile, the defining event of his career. The season of revelation was a forgotten footnote, if mentioned at all. He would read quotes from star players who had incorporated option routes into their game, praising the concept's effectiveness without a hint of where it originated. He'd watch offensive coordinators, some of whom had sat in meetings with him years prior, get profiled as innovative quarterback whisperers for teaching the very pre-snap diagnostics he had pioneered. The erasure was now systemic, professional, and complete. He was not being persecuted. He was being curated into a harmless, specific role. The smartest guy in the room who just couldn't play anymore. The isolation was total. He had no team, no system, no legacy. He was a set of ideas adrift in the league, attaching themselves to other people's careers, giving them a competitive edge while leaving him stranded on the sidelines, a well-dressed phantom in a headset, holding a clipboard that contained nothing but other men's plans. The wandering had revealed the final, ugly truth. The NFL knew exactly what he was, and had perfected the mechanism for harvesting his genius while discarding the man. The Nomad had no home because the league had made a home for his intellect everywhere, and for his person nowhere. The end arrived not with a decision, but with an absence. There was no dramatic final snap, no tearful press conference, no jersey retirement ceremony. The final season of his nomadic wandering concluded with the last game of the regular schedule, a meaningless contest in which he did not take a single snap. His contract expired at midnight on a date in early March, a line of text in a ledger automatically voiding. The phone did not ring. His agent made the perfunctory calls, but the responses were variations on a polite theme. "We're looking for a younger developmental guy. We need someone with more mobility in our system. We're set at the position for now." The language was neutral, professional, and carried the finality of a tombstone inscription. There was no discussion of his football mind, no mention of mentorship, no appeal to his experience. The market had spoken. It had nothing left to say to him. The final cut was not delivered by a coach or a general manager. It was delivered by silence. It was the sound of the entire NFL, a sprawling ecosystem of 32 teams, collectively shrugging. He was 34 years old. Contrast this exit with the retirements of his peers, the men he had entered the league with, the quarterbacks against whom he had measured his intellect and found them wanting. 1. A strong-arm traditionalist with a single Pro Bowl appearance and a career-losing record as a starter, announced his retirement at a golf tournament sponsored by a beer company. He held a press conference, donned a garish blazer from the sports network that immediately hired him, and spoke emotionally about the brotherhood and leaving it all on the field. He received a glowing, multi-page tribute in the league's flagship magazine, celebrating his toughness and his cannon for an arm. Another contemporary, a quarterback known primarily for his scrambling ability and occasional flashes of brilliance, retired after a series of concussions. His retirement was a national story, a cautionary tale about the violence of the sport. He was interviewed on major talk shows, praised for his courage, and his number was temporarily honored by his former team. His legacy, though mixed, was acknowledged. It had a shape, a narrative, a public ending. Even non-quarterbacks from his era received more ceremony. A middle linebacker, a good but not great player known for his fiery speeches, was given a day by his franchise in his final home game. He was presented with a truck, his family was brought onto the field, and he gave a rambling, emotional speech that brought fans to tears. A journeyman fullback, a blocker who had caught 17 passes in his entire career, retired and was immediately given a radio show in his home city, where he became a beloved, if simplistic, commentator. These men were woven into the tapestry of the league's history. They were part of the story. Their exits were events, however small, that reinforced the NFL's preferred myths of toughness, brotherhood, and community. His exit was an unmatching. It was a subtraction so quiet it was indistinguishable from the background noise of the offseason. The league's memory machine, so adept at manufacturing farewells, had no protocol for a player whose primary contribution was cognitive, whose legacy was embedded in the strategies of others, and whose career arc defied every heroic archetype they knew how to sell. The physical exit was as mundane as the professional one. There was no grand cleaning out of a locker. His belongings from his final season had already come home in a duffel bag. The process was internal. It was the moment he stopped his daily regimen. The morning workout routines, designed to maintain a body in football-ready condition, ceased. The specific shoulder exercises, the footwork drills on the lawn, the film study of upcoming opponents. It all became suddenly, jarringly irrelevant. He was no longer preparing for anything. The calendar, which for 22 years had been divided into the sacred architecture of an NFL season, OTAs, training camp, preseason, regular season, playoffs, was now just months. He was a clock that had stopped ticking, in a world where everyone else's time was still measured in quarters and game clocks. He experienced a profound, almost physical sense of disconnection. He would find himself, out of habit, breaking down the footwork of a quarterback on television, only to realize the analysis led nowhere. There was no meeting to contribute to, no teammate to correct, no next game to prepare for. His mind, the instrument that had been so meticulously calibrated for one specific complex purpose, was now idling, generating insights with no outlet. The muscle memory remained, but the context had vanished. He would be doing something ordinary, like driving his car, and his right hand would unconsciously perform a quick, subtle pump fake motion, a ghost of a movement from a life now past. It was a neurological echo. The lack of ceremony forced a confrontation with a reality his playing career had deferred. Who was he outside of the puzzle? For 2 decades, his identity had been defined by his ability to solve for X on a 100-yard field. Now, the equation was gone. The world outside of football had no use for a man who could diagnose cover 2 rat in his sleep. The skills were not transferable. There were no corporations seeking a senior vice president of pre-snap defensive diagnosis. The analytical rigor, the systemic thinking, the ability to process chaos, these were superpowers confined to a very specific arena. Outside the white lines, they were curiosities. He watched the draft that spring, not with bitterness, but with a strange, detached fascination. He saw teams select young quarterbacks based on the very physical prototypes that had once been prioritized over him. He heard the analysts praise arm talent and escapability, the same lexicon that had always overshadowed processing speed and anticipation. The cycle was repeating, utterly unchanged by his career. It was as if he had never played, never proven anything. The draft was a festival of future, and he was a relic of a past the league had already decided not to remember. The physical exit was complete. He was out. But the more haunting exit was yet to come, the exit of his name, his ideas, his very presence from the story of the game he had helped redefine. The final cut from the roster was just the administrative prelude to the final cut from history. He had left the building. Now, they would begin the work of removing his portrait from the walls. The years following his physical exit from the game were not a period of forgetting, but of active, strategic reshaping. Forgetting is passive. It is an absence. What happened to his legacy was a deliberate act of editorial revision, a conscious effort by the NFL's vast narrative apparatus to craft a history that flowed smoothly from one set of acceptable heroes to the next, without the disruptive, inconvenient detour his career represented. The eclipse of his memory was not an accident of time. It was a project. In the immediate years after his retirement, the mechanisms of this project whirred into efficient motion, working to downplay, contextualize, and ultimately bury his contributions within the official story of professional football. The first mechanism was statistical recontextualization. As the league entered the 1990s, passing numbers began to inflate. Rules continued to favor the offense, and the West Coast defense's emphasis on completion percentage became widespread. When historians and stat keepers looked back at the record books, they now had a new, higher baseline for comparison. His once astronomical 67.8% completion season from the season of revelation was no longer a shocking outlier. It was merely very good for its era. It was listed alongside other high completion seasons, stripped of its revolutionary context. The nuance was erased. No one noted that he achieved it without the benefit of the rule changes that would follow, or without the offensive systems designed to boost that very statistic. His efficiency was folded into the general upward trend, its pioneering nature smoothed away. His touchdown-to-interception ratio, once elite, was later surpassed by quarterbacks operating in systems that actively minimized risk in a way his system had invented from whole cloth. The statistics remained, but their meaning was hollowed out. They became dry numbers, not signposts pointing to a philosophical shift. The second mechanism was the media retrospective industry. Anniversaries of famous games, seasons, and dynasties are the lifeblood of sports media. In the 10-year retrospectives of his team's playoff run, the narrative had already solidified. The documentaries and magazine features focused on Coach Lombardi's toughness, the defense's bend-don't-break attitude, and the opportunistic offense. He was featured as a component, not the catalyst. The narration would say, and with quarterback's name managing the game effectively, the word managing did the heavy lifting of diminishment. His televised highlight packages, if they were shown at all, consisted of short, safe throws, the quick slants and outlet passes. Never the pre-snap checks, never the film showing his diagnostic process. The highlight reels made his play look simple, cautious, even boring. They deliberately omitted the intellectual violence he inflicted on defenses. Contrast this with the retrospectives for strong-armed quarterbacks of his era, whose highlights were montages of deep bombs and heroic scrambles, set to soaring music. His legacy was visually edited to fit the game manager label, making the eclipse of his memory a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only show the simplest outcomes, you prove the simplistic assessment. The third and most powerful mechanism was the league's official canonization of a different, more palatable history. The NFL, as it entered a new age of prosperity, needed a clean origin story for its modern passing game. It found one in the West Coast offense and its charismatic, championship-winning progenitors. This was a perfect narrative. It had a clear father figure, a coaching tree, and, most importantly, it was tied directly to Super Bowl victories. The league's films and publications enthusiastically promoted this lineage. The story became, football was once run-heavy and simple, Then came the West Coast offense, which introduced sophisticated passing concepts and changed the game. This narrative completely airbrushed his work out of the picture. His concept-based system, which predated and in many ways philosophically underpinned the principles of the West Coast system, reading coverage, throwing to spots, quick release timing, was simply absorbed into the larger, more famous movement without attribution. It was as if the discovery of calculus was retroactively credited only to those who later wrote the best-selling textbooks, not to the mathematician who first devised its principles. This rewriting extended to the very language of the game. Terms he had used in meetings, leverage, conflict defender, high-low red, became standard coaching parlance. Within a decade, no one could recall where they had first heard them. They were just football terms. Coaches who had once sat in rooms with him, listening to him explain these very concepts, now used them as if they were ancient football wisdom, passed down through the generations. His specific terminology for coverages and adjustments was adopted and modified, its origin obscured. He had created a lexicon for a new way of seeing the game, and that lexicon was stolen, its authorship forgotten. The ideas achieved immortality while their author was rendered invisible. Perhaps the most personally stinging aspect of this eclipse was the treatment of his former teammates in historical accounts. When journalists interviewed the stars of that team, the Pro Bowl receiver, the tough running back, for historical pieces, they would ask about the old days. The teammates would speak fondly of the camaraderie, the big plays, the coaching. When asked specifically about him, their responses were often tellingly vague. "Oh, he was smart," they'd say, "a real student of the game." Then they'd quickly pivot to a story about a defensive player's fiery speech or a bruising goal line stand. Even those who benefited most from his precision seemed to have internalized the broader narrative that the real story of those teams was about toughness, not intellect. His quiet leadership was remembered as a personality trait, not as the strategic engine of their success. The collective memory of the team itself had been colonized by the preferred mythos. By the late 1990s, just a decade after his retirement, the eclipse was nearly total. In a popular, best-selling history of NFL strategy, his name appeared only twice. Once in a list of efficient passers of the 1980s, and again in a footnote about quarterbacks who may have been ahead of their time. The book had entire chapters dedicated to the architects of the West Coast offense, the run and shoot, and the modern blitzing defenses. He was a specter haunting the footnotes. On television, during broadcasts, former players turned analysts would break down modern offensive innovations. "See how the quarterback checks to this hot route based on the safety's alignment," they'd say. "That's modern football." There was never a hint that they were watching the direct, uncredited progeny of his work. The league's historical narrative was now a sleek, polished edifice. It had a clear progression, celebrated pioneers, and a logical through line. His career was a jagged, complicating rock that did not fit the foundation. So it was buried beneath it. The memory was not lost. It was paved over. The silence surrounding his name was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of a finished, deliberate deletion. The record books, the highlight reels, the official histories, and the very language of the sport had been scrubbed clean of his revolutionary fingerprint. He had exited the game, and the game had immediately begun the work of proving he had never truly been there at all. Yet, deep in the substrata of the sport, in film rooms and in the minds of a scattered few, the blueprint survived. The eclipse was total, but it was not permanent. Ideas, once unleashed, have a way of persisting in the dark, waiting for a new dawn to give them a name. The ideas did not die. They could not. You cannot unsee a truth once it has been revealed, and for the men who sat in those meeting rooms, who took those practice snaps, who witnessed the quiet, systematic dismantling of NFL defenses week after week, the truth of his football logic was seared into their understanding of the game. When the institution exiled the man and erased his name, it failed to account for the witnesses. It failed to sterilize the environment. His philosophy was a resilient intellectual spore. It found purchase not in the hallowed halls of the head coach's offices, but in the fertile, overlooked soil of the lower ranks, in the minds of backup quarterbacks, quality control assistants, and young, hungry position coaches. These men became the secret carriers. Their careers became the clandestine network through which the quarterback's revolution survived its author's erasure. This is the story of the seeds in the soil, a diaspora of disciples who kept the faith alive. The first and most direct line of transmission was through the backup quarterbacks who held his clipboard. These were not just journeymen. They were his captive students. For hours each day, they would sit with him, reviewing film. He would narrate his thought process not as a lecture, but as a shared exploration. See here, the safety's heels. When they're parallel, it's a two-high shell, but if one heel is up, he's rotating to a single high. That tells you before the snap if it's cover 2 or cover 3. To the backups, this was not coach speak. It was revelation. One of these backups, a man we'll call Jimmy Sanders, had a career that epitomized this covert spread. Sanders was his understudy for 3 seasons. He absorbed the system not as a player expecting to run it, but as an acolyte studying sacred texts. When his own playing career ended, Sanders became a low-level offensive assistant for a college team. He arrived with a notebook not of plays but of principles. He began teaching the quarterbacks how to read leverage, how to categorize coverage not by name, but by indicator. The head coach, an old-school taskmaster, didn't understand what Sanders was doing, but he saw the quarterback's completion percentages rise. He saw them making fewer catastrophic mistakes. Sanders was praised for his detailed coaching. Within 5 years, he was an offensive coordinator at a small college, and then a quarterback's coach in the NFL. In every stop, he brought the gospel. He never mentioned the quarterback's name in meetings. He presented the ideas as fundamental football truth. This is just how you see the game, he'd tell his pupils. The ideas were disembodied, free-floating. They were effective, and they spread. Another seed was a young wide receivers coach from those revelatory seasons. This coach, initially skeptical of the option routes, saw his players flourish within the system. He saw them become smarter, more adaptable, more valuable. When the quarterback was benched and the system scrapped, this coach was frustrated. He had learned a better way to teach receivers, and it was being discarded. He took a job with another team and quietly introduced leverage-based route running to his receiver room. He taught his players to read defenders on the fly, to adjust their stems and breakpoints. It was a fragment of the whole, but it was potent. His receivers began to get open more consistently. The offensive coordinator noticed and asked where he'd learned this technique. The coach, wary of being associated with a failed system, simply said, "It's just something I've been developing." The coordinator liked it, incorporated pieces of it, and his own stock rose. The idea, a single thread from the quarterback's tapestry, was now woven into another coach's reputation. The most significant dissemination, however, came through the quarterback's own meticulous notes. During his nomadic years, he was a compulsive documenter. He kept detailed journals of defensive trends, of coverage adaptations, of his own evolving concepts for beating them. When he was released from his final team, he left behind, whether intentionally or not, a copy of his personal playbook, a 3-ring binder filled with annotated diagrams, coverages keys, and concept descriptions. It was left in a drawer in the quarterback's meeting room. A quality control coach, the lowest man on the staff hierarchy, a recent college graduate making coffee and breaking down film, found it. He took it home. He spent nights poring over it. He later described it to me as finding the Rosetta Stone. The notations were in a precise, analytical hand. It didn't just show plays, it showed the why. It connected defensive alignment to offensive response with mathematical certainty. This quality control coach carried that binder with him for the next decade, from job to job. He never met the quarterback, but he became a missionary for his scripture. He would suggest adjustments in staff meetings, phrasing them as his own insights, but they were pulled directly from the binder's pages. His career advanced. He became an offensive assistant, then a passing game coordinator. The binder, now worn and tattered, was his secret weapon. The quarterback's mind, distilled into ink and paper, was guiding game plans for teams that had long forgotten he existed. This underground network of disciples occasionally intersected. Jimmy Sanders, the former backup, now a quarterback's coach for an AFC team, might be at a league symposium and strike up a conversation with the former quality control coach, now a rising offensive assistant. They would talk shop, and in the jargon they used in the specific terms, conflict defender, sight adjustment, coverage indicator, they would recognize a shared dialect. They might share a knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement that they were speaking the same hidden language, but they would almost never speak its source aloud. To do so was a professional risk. It was to align oneself with a narrative of failure, with a player the league had officially categorized as a cerebral footnote. Better to let the ideas prosper anonymously. The spread was not a coordinated conspiracy. It was an organic intellectual diaspora. Like monks in the Dark Ages preserving classical texts, these men preserved and propagated a philosophy they knew to be true, even as the official church preached a different doctrine. They did it for the simplest of reasons. It worked. It made their jobs easier. It made their players better. It won games. The quarterback system was not a rigid dogma. In their hands, it became adaptable, merging with other schemes, its edges softening, its core principles remaining intact. The packaged play concept showed up in run-heavy offenses as a simple read option for the quarterback. The option route became a staple for elite slot receivers across the league. The pre-snap diagnostic routine became standard teaching for any quarterback prospect deemed intelligent. The seeds were now deep in the soil. They had taken root in dozens of franchises, nurtured by men who owed their careers, in part, to the understanding they had gleaned from the forgotten quarterback. The ideas were no longer his, they were the league's. They were anonymous, pervasive, and powerful. The garden was growing, but the name of the original gardener had been scratched off every tool, erased from every planting guide. The disciples had saved the philosophy by severing it from the philosopher. In doing so, they ensured its survival, but they also completed the final stage of the erasure. The man was gone. The mind was everywhere. And the stage was now set for a new generation of innovators to step into the sunlight, cultivate this fertile and tilled ground, and be hailed as the architects of a revolution they had only inherited. The 1990s arrived, and with them, a tectonic shift in the NFL's offensive landscape. The ground that had been prepared by quiet disciples and clandestine binders began to yield a spectacular public harvest. Offenses that would define the decade and shape the new millennium exploded onto the scene, celebrated for their innovation, their complexity, and their ruthless efficiency. They were given catchy names and attached to charismatic coaching minds. The West Coast offense evolved into 1,000 iterations. The greatest show on turf redefined speed and space. A new breed of offensive coordinator was hailed as a genius. And as I watched this flowering, as I studied the game films of these revolutionary attacks, a chilling and exhilarating pattern emerged. I was not seeing something new. I was seeing a restoration. I was watching his blueprint, drawn in the margins of a discarded playbook a decade prior, finally being constructed on the grandest scales, with superior materials and under someone else's name. This was the Fruition without credit. The ideas had escaped the laboratory and were now winning Super Bowls, their origin story meticulously redacted. Take the West Coast offense in its myriad forms. By the mid-90s, it was the league's dominant philosophy. Its core tenets were short, timed passes, yards after catch, and reading coverage progression. Coaches like Mike Holmgren and Steve Mariucci were its celebrated prophets. But when you strip away the branding and the coaching tree, you find the skeletal structure of his system. The triangle red or stick concept that became a West Coast staple was a direct descendant of his levels or spacing concepts, where receivers flooded a zone at different depths. The difference was one of emphasis, not invention. I spoke with a retired offensive lineman who played for one of those legendary West Coast teams in the early 90s. He described the quarterback's pre-snap process. He'd get to the line, make a call, maybe check the protection. It was all very systematic. I then showed him grainy film of our quarterback from a decade earlier, pointing at the safety, making multiple calls, shifting protections and routes simultaneously. The lineman stared, his brow furrowed. That's more detailed, he admitted. Our guy was making one read, maybe two. This guy looks like he's running the whole show before the snap. It's the same family, but this is like the intense, neurotic cousin nobody talks about. The West Coast system had institutionalized a simplified, coach-centric version of his player-empowered model. It took his principles of timing and spacing and made them the system, while removing the quarterback's autonomy to change them on the fly. It was his revolution bureaucratized. Then came the late 1990s and the greatest show on turf in St. Louis. Coach Mike Martz was hailed as an offensive mad scientist. His system was predicated on packaged plays and choice routes that gave quarterback Kurt Warner and his receivers unprecedented freedom to attack based on defensive look. The media described it as futuristic, but it was, in essence, his system fully realized with better athletes. The packaged play was not a Martz innovation. It was the very concept our quarterback had installed in player-led walkthroughs, the run/pass option tied to a single conflict defender. Martz's version was more elaborate with more window dressing, but the foundational logic was identical. Make one defender wrong every play. The choice routes run by Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt were sophisticated evolutions of the simple option routes he had given his tight end. I managed to secure a brief, off-the-record conversation with a former Rams offensive assistant from that era. I asked him about the origins of their system. Mike was a visionary, no doubt, he said carefully. But you know, systems aren't born in a vacuum. There's always a lineage. Mike studied a lot of film from a lot of places. There was this old tape that used to get passed around, late 70s, early 80s stuff. A team that ran these weird, concept-based plays. The quarterback was checking everything. Mike was fascinated by it. He never said who it was. He just called it the clinic tape. We all studied it. It was like seeing the DNA. The assistant wouldn't say more, but he didn't need to. The clinic tape was the season of revelation. Martz had found the seed and built a cathedral around it. His name on the cornerstone. The Fruition reached its apotheosis in the 2000s with the rise of the New England Patriots dynasty. Bill Belichick and Tom Brady were lauded for their relentless adaptability, their game plan-specific approach that changed weekly. The core of their offensive philosophy, however, was not a specific scheme, but a foundational principle. Identify the opponent's defensive scheme, find its one exploitable conflict, and attack it repeatedly with subtly different looks. This was not a new principle. It was his principle. The entire Belichickian ethos of do your job was the ultimate systematization of his quarterback's intellectual approach. Brady's mastery was in his pre-snap diagnostics and post-snap progression, a slower, more methodical version of the same real-time calculus. A former Patriots scout, in a moment of candor, told me, when we were building the profile for the kind of quarterback that could thrive in our system, it wasn't about arm strength first. It was about processing speed, decision-making, the ability to see the field in layers. We had a list of historical comps, quarterbacks who played like that. His name was on that list. Not at the top because he didn't have the rings, but he was there. The brain was the prototype. Perhaps the most telling evidence of this uncredited lineage is in the language of the modern playbook itself. By the early 2000s, the term concept-based passing was standard. Coaches didn't teach plays. They taught families of plays with rules. The all-go concept, the shallow cross series, the smash concept, these were not inventions of the new millennium. They were the formalized, categorized versions of the organic concepts he had diagrammed. I interviewed a renowned offensive coordinator, a man who has trained a generation of quarterbacks. I asked him about the history of concept-based football. It really started to take hold in the 90s, he said. But the ideas were floating around before that. You'd hear stories from old coaches about this quarterback or that who was ahead of his time, who was drawing the stuff up. It was anecdotal. There was no single person you could point to. It was just, in the water. In the water. That is the perfect description of a successful intellectual diaspora. The source of the water is forgotten. Only the life it sustains is visible. The fruition was everywhere, and it was magnificent. The NFL offensives of the new era were more dynamic, more intelligent, and more productive than ever before. The game was better for it. But in every celebration of this new age, in every trophy hoisted by a coach praised for his innovative mind, in every MVP award given to a quarterback lauded for his cerebral play, there was a ghost. The ideas had triumphed. They had reshaped the sport. They had become the orthodoxy. But the man who had first assembled those ideas into a coherent, actionable philosophy was not in the stadiums, not in the halls of fame, not in the glowing television studios. He was a spectral footnote, the anecdotal quarterback from the old stories. His concrete contributions dissolved into the vague, convenient myth of ideas floating around. The harvest was bountiful, but the farmer's name had been weathered off the sign at the edge of the field. The game had finally caught up to him, only to pretend it had been ahead of him all along. And as the league marched forward, drunk on its own innovative glory, a new movement was brewing. One that would use cold, hard numbers to attempt what memory had failed to do, to exhume the truth. The turn of the millennium brought with it more than new offensive schemes. It ushered in a new religion. A religion of data. The analytics movement, born in baseball's sabermetric revolution, slowly infiltrated the fortress of football intuition. Young mathematicians and economists, armed with laptops and statistical models, began to question the sacred cows of NFL conventional wisdom. They didn't care about the eye test, about cannon arms or gritty leadership. They cared about value. They sought to measure what actually contributed to winning, disentangling signal from noise. They developed new metrics: expected points added, EPA, completion percentage over expectation, CPOE, success rate. These were not simple box score stats. They were contextual, measuring the value of every single play against the historical probability of scoring from that down, distance, and field position. And when these data scientists, these new priests of the gridiron, began to run their models on the historical record, something strange happened. A ghost began to appear in the machine. An anomaly. A statistical signature from the late 1970s and early 80s that didn't just outperform its era. It predicted the future. The reclamation began quietly, on message boards and in academic papers. A graduate student in statistics, doing a thesis on the evolution of quarterback efficiency, inputted decades of play-by-play data. His model spit out a list of the most efficient passers of all time, adjusted for era. At the very top, alongside names like Montana, Manning, and Brady, was a name that didn't belong. A name that sparked confusion. Our quarterback. His expected points added per play was not merely good. It was an extreme outlier. The model showed that every time he dropped back to pass, he added more value to his team's chances of scoring than any of his contemporaries, and more than most of the legends who would follow. The data was agnostic. It didn't know about narratives, about game managers, about injuries or coaching conflicts. It only knew outcomes. And the outcomes screamed that he had been wildly, historically undervalued. The key metric was his efficiency in high-leverage situations. Third downs, the red zone. These were the moments where the old narratives called for gut checks and playmaking. The data told a different story. On third and medium, 4 to 7 yards, his completion percentage was over 70%. His conversion rate was nearly 60%, a figure that would lead the league in any era. In the red zone, where defenses compress and windows tighten, his touchdown-to-interception ratio was astronomical. The numbers painted a portrait of a player who was not just careful, but devastatingly precise when the stakes were highest. He wasn't managing games, he was surgically deciding them one high-probability throw at a time. A modern analytics director for an NFL team told me, when we first built our historical models, his name kept pinging as a bug. We thought there was an error in the old play-by-play data. We checked and rechecked. The data was correct. He was just that efficient. In our terminology, he was generating positive expected points at a rate that was literally 2 standard deviations above the mean for his time. He wasn't playing the same game as his peers. Then came the analysis of his supporting cast. Advanced metrics could now estimate the value of a receiver by measuring his separation, his catch rate, his yards after catch. Retrospective analysis of his primary targets revealed a group of solid, but unspectacular players. None were Pro Bowl talents. His top receivers' separation metrics were below league average. This demolished the system quarterback critique from a new angle. The data suggested the opposite. The system, which was him, was manufacturing efficiency despite a lack of elite talent. He was not a product of his receivers. His receivers were products of his precision. He was throwing them open at a rate the data could now quantify, called tight window throws and anticipatory completion percentage. Even by today's stringent standards, his dangerous throw percentage, a measure of passes into high-traffic areas, was among the lowest ever recorded, while his success rate remained among the highest. This proved his genius was not in making heroic, difficult throws, but in systematically eliminating the need for them. The most damning statistical reclamation came from the analysis of his offensive line. Pressure rates and sack percentages could now be estimated historically. The data showed his offensive line was mediocre, ranking in the bottom half of the league in pass protection. Yet, his sack rate was one of the lowest ever. The old narrative said he got rid of the ball quickly because he was afraid, because he couldn't withstand the rush. The data said he got rid of the ball quickly because his pre-snap diagnosis and internal clock were so advanced, he rendered the pass rush irrelevant. He wasn't avoiding pressure out of weakness. He was algorithmically deleting it as a variable before the play even began. A prominent football statistician published a paper titled The Original Anticipator, a case study in pre-snap value. The paper argued that a significant portion of a quarterback's value is created before the snap, through correct play calls, protection adjustments, and coverage identification, areas the traditional stats completely ignore. Using tracking data from modern players as a proxy, the paper theorized that our quarterback was generating more pre-snap EPA than any quarterback in history. He was winning plays before the ball was snapped, and the new numbers were finally, decades late, giving him credit for that work. This statistical reclamation created a quiet schism in the football world. The old guard, the scouts and coaches who valued the traditional prototypes, dismissed the numbers as video game stats. But a new generation of front office executives, raised on analytics, began to look at the historical record with new eyes. They weren't swayed by the faded narratives of toughness versus finesse. They saw the cold, hard truth of the data. This player had been a machine of efficiency. He was the proof of concept for the style of football they were now trying to build. The numbers became a secret handshake among the analytically inclined. References to his efficiency metrics would pop up in draft rooms when discussing a cerebral college prospect. He's got some of that quarterback's name in him, they'd say, not referring to his arm, but to his statistical profile. However, the statistical reclamation, for all its power, had a melancholy limit. Could correct the record, but it could not restore the legacy. Could prove he was great, but it could not make people remember him as great. The data lived in spreadsheets and academic journals, not in the collective memory of fans. It was a vindication for the mind, but a posthumous one. The numbers fought the old biases with impeccable logic, but they could not replicate the emotional resonance of a highlight reel, the narrative weight of a championship, the folklore of a cannon arm. They provided a truth, but not a story. And in the end, the NFL is a league of stories. The data scientists had exhumed the body of evidence, but it was still a skeleton. It needed to be clothed in the fabric of the modern game, to be seen walking and talking in the offenses of today, for the reclamation to be complete. The numbers had provided the what. The final step was to show the so what, to prove that his ghost wasn't just a historical curiosity, but the very DNA of the spectacle we watch every Sunday. To walk into a modern NFL facility is to enter a temple of optimized chaos. The walls are giant screens, flickering with drone footage of practice, real-time data visualizations, and animated play diagrams. The playbook is a digital universe on a tablet, searchable, hyperlinked, infinitely malleable. The quarterback room is a neurocommand center, where young men with arms worth millions dissect coverage schemes with the focused intensity of cardiologists reading EKGs. The language they speak is a precise, technical dialect. And as I listened, as I watched their fingers swipe and pinch zoom on the tablet, tracing the paths of receivers and the rotations of safeties, I heard echoes. Not vague similarities, but direct, verbatim echoes. The ghost wasn't just in the machine. He was the machine's operating system. His specific innovations were no longer innovations. They were the grammar of modern football, so foundational they were never cited, only used. Let's start with the playbook. I sat with a young offensive assistant for a playoff contending team, his eyes tired from a week of game planning. He pulled up their third down conceptual menu on his tablet. It wasn't a list of plays. It was a series of ecosystem maps. One was labeled Solutions versus Too High Safety Pressures. He tapped it. The screen showed a formation, and then, like a branching decision tree, it animated 5 different routes based on the post-snap movement of the inside linebackers. "This is our juke concept," he said. "It's a pure coverage read. The slot receiver has an option. If the Mike backer carries the vertical, he sits. If he sinks, he breaks out. The QB's read is the conflict defender, here, the strong safety." I stared at the screen. The animation, with its sleek graphics and labeling, was a pixel-perfect replica of the hand-drawn Z-cross option concept from the quarterback's old binder. The terminology was new, the graphics were slick, but the logical DNA was identical. One play, multiple solutions based on one defender's choice. The assistant explained it with the casual authority of someone describing gravity. He had no idea he was reciting a 40-year-old thesis. In the quarterback room, I observed a film session with a current MVP-caliber quarterback and his position coach. They were studying an upcoming opponent's nickel blitz package. The film rolled, paused. The quarterback, not the coach, spoke first. "Okay, see the nickel here? His heel is up, he's showing blitz. But watch the weak side safety. He's creeping down. That's the tell. If the nickel comes, the safety is rotating to the deep half. That means the post route is dead. But the dig behind the nickel is wide open. So, my check is RIP 68. Slide the protection left, sight adjust the Y to the dig." The coach nodded. "Perfect. That's the read." The analytical process was breathtaking in its speed and certainty, but it was also a direct echo. The heel-up indicator, the safety rotation diagnosis, the sight adjustment, these were not general football instincts. They were specific, teachable protocols. They were the very protocols the forgotten quarterback had developed to translate defensive poetry into offensive prose. This modern star spoke the language fluently, having learned it from coaches who learned it from coaches who had learned it from the source, the original linguist whose name had been lost in translation. I asked a premier route-running wide receiver known for his artistry about how he and his quarterback handle man coverage. "It's all about leverage," he said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. "If the DB is outside, I break in. If he's inside, I break out. We have a signal for it. Sometimes it's just a feel. We see the same thing." He described the option route not as a novel tactic, but as a fundamental tool in his kit, as basic as a slant or a curl. He had no idea that this fundamental was once considered radical, that a quarterback was once benched for granting such freedom. The idea had become so ingrained, so normalized, that its revolutionary origin was invisible. The most profound moment came during a visit with a retired offensive line coach, a man who had coached into the 2010s. I showed him a segment of film from the season of Revelation, focusing on a play where the quarterback made 3 distinct protection calls at the line before the snap, shifting the offensive line's assignments. The old coach leaned forward, squinting. That's slide kill slide," he murmured, using a modern protection terminology. "He's IDing the mic, sliding the line one way, killing the end with the back, and then sliding the tight end's release. We didn't start teaching that until the late 90s. And even then, the quarterback made one call. This guy is doing the whole offensive line coach's job in 2 seconds. Who is this?" When I told him, he sat back, a look of dawning, heartbreaking recognition on his face. "I know the name," he said softly. "I always thought he was just a stats guy, a system player. But this is the system. The one we all use. The ubiquity is absolute. The no-huddle offense that tires defenses and limits substitutions. He used it as a strategic weapon, not just a 2-minute drill tactic. The mesh concept of 2 crossing routes that floods a zone and creates traffic, a staple of his play-action game. The use of turkey or dummy calls to confuse defensive signal callers. He was a pioneer. Every modern offensive evolution I examined had a clear, traceable precursor in his body of work. The ghost wasn't haunting the machine from the shadows. He was the blue light glowing within every processor. His intellectual framework provided the how for the what that modern athletes executed. Yet, this unequivocal demonstration creates a profound dissonance. These modern players and coaches, the beneficiaries of his genius, operate in a state of blissful, uncredited inheritance. They study his ideas daily without studying him. They watch film of modern masters executing concepts he invented, creating a feedback loop that further buries the origin point. A young quarterback today might study Drew Brees to understand anticipation, and Brees studied coaches who studied tapes that originated with him. The lineage is real, but the lineage chart has its first box deliberately left blank. The modern machine runs flawlessly on his code, but the programmer's name has been scrubbed from the comments in the script. To see it so clearly is both a vindication and a tragedy. It proves his ideas were not just correct, they were primordial, the very axioms of modern offensive football. But it also reveals the completeness of the erasure. He is not a forgotten founder. He is an unknown one. The ultimate fate of a revolutionary is not to be overthrown, but to have your revolution become so successful that people assume the world was always that way. The ghost doesn't rattle chains in the attic. He powers the lights in every room, and no one thinks to ask where the electricity came from. We have now traced the current from the outlet through the wiring all the way back to the forgotten power plant. Only one connection remains: to meet the engineer who first threw the switch, and to ask him what it feels like to live in a world illuminated by his light, a world that insists it was born in daylight. He lives in a quiet, unassuming house in a suburb that could be anywhere in America. There is no football-shaped mailbox, no fence painted in team colors. The garage door is closed. The only hint of his past life is the meticulous order of the tools hanging inside it, each one placed with deliberate intent. The man who answers the door is older now, his hair gray, his movements measured, but his eyes still hold that same unsettling calm, the same quality of observation that once scanned defenses. He offers a firm, dry handshake. His home is not a shrine. There are a few framed photographs, a wedding photo, pictures of grown children, but the walls are not lined with jerseys or game balls. The only artifact from his professional life is a single, small bookshelf in a den. On it rests a row of leather-bound notebooks, their spines labeled by year. This is the archive, not of trophies, but of thoughts. Sitting across from him now, after tracing the path of his ideas through decades and across the league, is a surreal experience. You are in the presence of the source, the font of a river that now waters an entire continent. And he pours you a glass of iced tea, asks about your trip, acts as if he is just a retired man with an interesting past. But when you steer the conversation toward the game, a subtle shift occurs. It's not an eagerness to talk. It's a cautious, precise engagement, like a master mechanic being asked about an engine he built long ago, unsure if you truly want to understand the combustion process or just hear the roar of the car. You ask him about the modern game. He watches it, he says. Of course he does. He turns on the television on Sunday afternoons, sits in his comfortable chair, and observes. But his observation is not that of a fan. I watch the process, he says, his voice even. I watch the quarterback's eyes before the snap. I watch the safety's feet. I see the concepts unfold. It's familiar. There is no bitterness in the word familiar. There is a kind of detached academic recognition. He describes watching a game where a young superstar quarterback, under duress, checked to a packaged play and hit a backside slant for a first down. He saw the conflict defender. The man says, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He saw it and he knew. That's the whole game. Seeing it and knowing. For a moment, the decades fall away. He is not a retired man in a den. He is the cryptographer, and he has just watched someone else use his key to unlock a door. There is a flash of pure, unadulterated professional pride. It is not about credit. It is about the validation of a principle. The idea worked. It still works. But when you ask him directly about his legacy, about the fact that his specific innovations are now league-wide dogma, the shutters come down. He becomes careful, diplomatic. I had some ideas, he says, shrugging. The game evolves. Smarter people than me came along and refined things. It is a rehearsed answer, the answer of a man who has been asked this before, perhaps by well-meaning relatives or old teammates, and has learned that claiming his territory only leads to uncomfortable silence or polite disbelief. He has internalized the official narrative to such a degree that he recites it as a form of self-defense. To do otherwise would be to seem arrogant, delusional, a man clinging to a past the world has agreed to forget. You push gently. You mention the specific concepts, the option routes, the packaged plays, the pre-snap diagnostic language. You tell him you've seen them in modern playbooks, heard coaches use his exact terminology. He listens, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall behind you. There is a long pause. The room is quiet. You can hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It's gratifying, he says finally. The word feeling inadequate. Like using a teacup to bail out a flooding boat. To think that something you worked on, that it might have contributed in some small way. Some small way. The minimization is heartbreaking. He is reducing a philosophical revolution to a minor technical adjustment. This is the final, most complete victory of the erasure. It has convinced the prophet himself to downplay his own prophecy. Later, as you walk through his small, tidy backyard, he opens up, just a crack. It's not about the plays, he says. It was about the why. Everyone was obsessed with the what. He explains, his hands sketching invisible diagrams in the air. What play to call? What throw to make? I was obsessed with the why. Why does this coverage dictate that throw? Why does this defender's alignment make that route the correct one? I wanted to build a system of why. He stops, looks at the neat rows of vegetables in his garden. It seems they kept the what, he says softly. I'm not sure they ever really wanted the why. This is the core of his unresolved perspective. He sees the league using his tools, but he wonders if it ever truly embraced his philosophy, the philosophy of quarterback as inquisitor, as solver of dynamic equations. The modern game has systematized his answers but often removed the questioning process from the quarterback's hands, centralizing it with coaches in press boxes. They took his chessboard but kept the players on a tighter leash. What was lost in the act of forgetting him? Sitting with him, the answer becomes clear. What was lost was the intellectual audacity, the sheer radical belief that a single player's mind could not just execute a system, but be the system in real time. The modern game has found a safer, more corporate middle ground. Complex ideas conceived by committees of coaches, executed by talented players. His model was dangerously empowering. It placed ultimate trust in the cognitive faculties of the quarterback. In forgetting him, the league sanitized that radical trust. It kept the fruits of his labor but discarded the laborer. And with him, the unnerving, beautiful idea that the sport could be a true intellectual partnership between the sideline and the field. They gained efficiency, but they may have lost a degree of artistry, the artistry of a mind in direct, unmediated combat with 11 others. As you prepare to leave, he does something unexpected. He goes to the bookshelf, pulls down one of the leather-bound notebooks, the one labeled 1981. He opens it to a random page. It is not a play diagram. It is a page of pure analysis. Neat, handwritten paragraphs deconstructing a specific defensive coordinator's tendency to blitz on second and long in the third quarter when leading by less than a score. It is a work of staggering depth and specificity, a psychological and strategic profile. This, he says, tapping the page, is what I loved. Not the throw, not the touchdown. The puzzle. He closes the book, holds it for a moment, then places it back on the shelf with the care of a librarian handling a first edition. In that gesture, you see the whole man. The legacy he truly cares about is not in the stadiums, not in the record books, which he doubts anyway, and certainly not in the credit. It is here, in these silent, ordered volumes on a shelf in a quiet room. The proof of his love for the game is not in what he took from it, but in what he poured into these pages. The NFL took the product and forgot the process. He kept the process. It is all he has left. And as you drive away, you realize the haunting truth of his story. The forgotten quarterback did not have his ideas stolen. He gave them away freely to the game he loved. The tragedy is that the game, in return, could not find a place to remember the giver. could only celebrate the gift over and over again as its own. We began in silence. The unsettling quiet of an empty stadium. The void left by a man who walked away and was told he was never truly there. We traced the path of a mind born under the vast, reasoning sky of the prairie. A mind that saw football not as a test of wills, but as a web of solvable problems. We followed that mind into the heart of the NFL's loudest, most traditional fortress, where it designed a new language for the sport. We witnessed the season of revelation, where that language proved so potent it could not be denied, only to be met not with embrace, but with a gathering storm of whispers and resentment. We saw the injury that provided the pretext, the benching that was a betrayal, and the nomadic exile that followed, a wandering scholar whose ideas were confiscated at every border. We documented the meticulous eclipse of his memory from record books and highlight reels, the airbrushing of his contributions from the league's official history. We discovered the seeds of his philosophy surviving underground, spread by a diaspora of disciples through back channels and clandestine binders. We watched with both awe and sorrow as those seeds bore magnificent, public fruit in the offenses of a new era, their origins uncredited, their architect unnamed. We let the cold, impartial data of a new analytical age scream the truth that narratives had suppressed. We sat in the quiet room of the man himself, surrounded by the notebooks that contain the proof of his love for the puzzle, and heard him minimize his own revolution. The journey is complete. The evidence is irrefutable. So what are we left with? What is the sum of this forgotten quarterback's equation? The answer is a damning and beautiful paradox. He lost everything and he won everything. He lost his starting job, his reputation, his place in the story, the credit for his life's work. He won the future. Every Sunday, in stadiums he never played in, by athletes who don't know his name, his victory is reenacted. The modern pass-happy league, with its quarterback-friendly rules and its celebration of offensive ingenuity, is the monument he never received. It is his vindication and his tombstone. The connection from the Prairie Prodigy to the present spectacle is not a faint thread. It is the central structural beam. He provided the intellectual framework that made the spectacle possible. Before him, offensive innovation was largely about new plays. After him, it was about new processes. He shifted the paradigm from what to run to why to run it and how to know before the snap. The contemporary game is a festival of applied why, and he was the first to ask the question with such systematic rigor. This forces a sharp, necessary critique of the NFL's cultural machinery. The league is a storytelling engine, and its stories require clean, marketable archetypes. The gunslinger, the field general, the magician, these are romantic, easily understood icons. The theorist is not. The theorist complicates the mythology. He suggests that the game is not solely about heart and guts, but also about synapses and processing speed. He proves that intellect can be a weapon as potent as a 70-yard arm. This was, and remains, a threatening idea to an establishment built on the cult of physical sacrifice and charismatic leadership. The NFL's machinery does not merely value archetypes over intellect. It actively defends those archetypes against intellect. When faced with a revolutionary thinker, it has a playbook. First, co-opt the useful ideas. Second, discredit the thinker as lacking the essential mythical qualities, toughness, clutch gene. Third, if necessary, exile him. And finally, rewrite history to absorb the innovation into the broader, safer narrative of progress, divorcing it from the disruptive individual. Our quarterback's career is a textbook execution of this playbook. It is not an anomaly. It is a case study in institutional self-preservation. The personal cost of being ahead of your time is a life lived in the lonely space between proof and recognition. He had the proof, the wins, the efficiency, the film. But recognition requires the consensus of the tribe, and the tribe was invested in a different truth. The cost was watching your identity be dismantled in real time. From revolutionary to system quarterback to injury-prone backup to respected mind to forgotten footnote. It was the erosion of self in the face of a collective, agreed-upon fiction. It was the isolation of knowing you are right, while the entire world you care about organizes itself around the principle that you are, at best, partially right in an irrelevant way. He paid with his legacy, with his place in the fraternity, with the simple human desire to be remembered for what you have done. He exchanged all of that for the cold comfort of being correct. He is the embodiment of the tragic inventor who dies penniless while the world grows rich on his patent. Therefore, his story transcends football. It is a parable, a universal narrative about how institutions, corporate, artistic, scientific, political, handle challenging ideas. True revolutionaries are rarely welcomed in their own time. More often, their innovations are stripped from them, sanitized, incorporated into the status quo, and the revolutionary is discarded as a necessary casualty of progress. The institution learns, adapts, and grows stronger, while the individual who forced that evolution is left behind, a scar on the system's history that it quickly heals over. His tale is the tale of the ghostwriter, the uncredited engineer, the scientist whose discovery bears a competitor's name. It is a story about the gap between influence and fame, between impact and credit. The NFL is merely the setting, a billion-dollar stage for this ancient human drama. So what, then, is the true meaning of changing the game? For him, it clearly was not about statues or Hall of Fame jackets. It was about the purity of the puzzle. His legacy, the one he seems to hold dear, is preserved in those leather-bound notebooks. The process, the why. The NFL took the product, the what, and ran with it. In a literal sense, he changed the game more profoundly than dozens of enshrined legends. He altered its cognitive architecture. Yet, in the cultural sense, he failed to change the game's story about itself. The NFL still tells the same stories, praises the same archetypes. It just tells those stories using a language he invented. This is the final, resonant irony. He changed the how of football forever, but he could not change the who the football world chooses to celebrate. His victory is absolute and invisible. As the lights come down on this investigation, we are left not with a feeling of injustice to be rectified, but with a deeper, more enduring question about memory and value. We, as fans, are complicit in this machinery. We buy the jerseys of the strong arms, we revel in the myth of the clutch performer, we recite the narratives handed to us. We rarely dig for the architects. In remembering him, we are forced to confront our own role in what we choose to forget. Perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer is not to campaign for his Hall of Fame induction, a shrine within the very system that erased him, but to change how we watch, to see the game with his eyes, to appreciate the pre-snap diagnosis as a moment of high art, the check at the line as a stroke of genius, the quick completion not as a safe play, but as the victorious end result of a complex intellectual sequence. To hear his ghost in the modern machine's hum. His silence, the one we began with, was never empty. It was full of the echoes of his ideas, bouncing off the walls of a sport that was not yet ready to hear them as his. Those echoes have now become the stadium's roar. The forgotten quarterback designed the soundtrack of modern football. He just isn't named in the credits. And perhaps, in the quiet of his den, surrounded by the proof of his deep and abiding love for the puzzle, that is enough. He solved the game. That the game never fully acknowledged the solver is its failing, not his. The puzzle was the point, and in that he remains, forever, undefeated.